Chapter 388. Outside the Temple of Fate, High Priestess Trisilae slowly got up. The voice was still lingering in her ears. Trisilae's face was filled with a kind of piety as if she was on a pilgrimage. She stared at the direction of the half-elven palace. Sylph. Trisilae gently said the name, and then as if she had gained some kind of firm belief, she strode toward the Temple of Fate. Along the way, the priests in the temple gathered around and asked at once, "Your Excellency, what was that just now? Was it the oracle of the goddess of fate? Did the blessing of blood you presided over succeed?" Trisilae put down her hands and made a gesture to calm them down. She said, "Everyone, now I have something more important to do. Please allow me to explain to you later." Only then did the priests realize that there was a silent armored man behind Trisilae. At the same time, there was a crisp sound of horse hooves outside the temple. Obviously, this place had been surrounded by the blood cavalry. They suddenly realized something, and their faces turned pale. They didn't dare to say more and let Trisilae lead the armored man into the temple. After passing through the prayer hall and a quiet corridor, Trisilae led the armored man to a wooden door. Knock knock. Trisilae gently knocked on the wooden door and asked, "Mark Vincent, are you inside?" There was no response. Trisilae was about to knock again, but suddenly she found that her arm was grabbed by the armored man behind her and then pulled back violently. Before Trisilae could ask the question, the wooden door in front of her suddenly exploded. Boom! Countless fine wood chips flew around under the huge impact. Trisilae widened her eyes and looked in horror at a warhammer the size of a baby's head coming out from behind the door. Fortunately, the armored man blocked in time in front of Trisilae. The warhammer hit the armored man's chest hard, and suddenly a deep dent was made. But the armored man didn't seem to feel it at all. He didn't retreat but rushed into the wooden door with an indomitable momentum. Boom! The terrible power completely smashed the shaky wooden door, and large pieces of wood and dust filled the space. Trisilae was thrown out by the armored man. She staggered a few steps before she steadied herself against the railing. Raising her head, she saw Mark Vincent sitting upright on a chair, swirling a glass of red wine in his hand. He looked at Trisilae coldly and said, "High Priestess, I didn't expect you to bring me such a surprise." After the ceremony, Trisilae told Marquis Vincent that she wanted to personally confirm the results of the ceremony. Only then did she leave the temple and go to Half-Elven Palace. However, when Marquis Vincent heard that godlike name, he immediately guessed that he might have been betrayed. Trisilae smiled faintly and replied, "Sir Marquis, Her Majesty the Queen has given birth to a daughter successfully. Shouldn't you go and congratulate her?" Marquis Vincent sneered, "Do you really think you've made a wise choice, Trisilae? But let me tell you, people like you who don't keep their promises and go back on their words won't be valued by anyone." Trisilae said expressionlessly, "For the glory of the goddess to be able to shine on this land, sacrificing my reputation is nothing." The corner of Marquis Vincent's mouth twitched, but he didn't say anything. He could see that this high priestess of the goddess of fate was a crazy believer. She couldn't be judged by common sense. Trisilae also didn't say anything, quietly watching the battle in front of her. Similar to the priests of the Church of Radiance, the priests of the Temple of Fate weren't a fighting profession. Trisilae saw the situation in front of her and didn't have any thoughts of going forward to help. She only hoped that the mysterious armored man sent by Earl Angelo could smoothly subdue Marquis Vincent's guard. Bang, bang, bang. Under the powerful attacks of the armored man, Marquis Vincent's night guard had no choice but to retreat step by step. The aftermath of the battle spread out in the narrow space, causing the whole building to shake. Dust and gravel rustled down, as if the whole building would collapse in the next second. "Or you?" Marquis Vincent couldn't help but ask. He knew that his guard was a 5th-grade knight. To be able to suppress him like this, it had to be a 6th-grade knight. But when did the half-elves have such an expert? As for the Angeli family, Marquis Vincent didn't think that they would have a fighter of this level. Even the House of St. Hilda might not be able to send such a 6th-grade expert to Silvermoon City. The armored man didn't pay attention to Marquis Vincent's question. The sword in his hand turned into a shadow, constantly stabbing at the vital points of the Eastern Knight's body. The Eastern Knight dodged left and right, barely dodging, but suddenly found a silver sword drawing a strange curve in front of his eyes, instantly chopping at his right hand. The Eastern Knight screamed. His entire right hand was cut off, and the warhammer in his hand fell to the ground. Marquis Vincent's expression changed. He got up without hesitation, threw the wine glass in his hand at the armored man, and then rushed to the window. Bang! Seeing Marquis Vincent break the window and escape, the armored man immediately chased after him. Boom! At this moment, the wooden cabinet by the window suddenly exploded, and a knight bathed in golden light rushed out. He was also wearing a heavy armor and holding a long spear. His whole body was like an angry black bear, charging at the armored man. The armored man was caught off guard and was stabbed in the waist by the long spear. The huge impact made the tip of the spear instantly penetrate the armor and come out from the other side. The Eastern Knight didn't have the slightest intention of holding back. Holding the spear with both hands, he continued to charge forward. Boom! The armored man was pushed back by the long spear until he slammed into the stone wall, creating a big hole. The situation took a turn for the worse, and Trisley, who was watching the battle from the sidelines, could not help but exclaim. But before she could react, she saw Marquis Vincent, who had fled, suddenly appear at the hole behind the armored man. Go to hell. Marquis Vincent sneered and stabbed a sharp sword into the armored man's back. But just when the Eastern Marquis thought the situation was settled, the armored man suddenly stretched out his hands and quickly reached forward. The Eastern Knight in front of him was careless and couldn't dodge. His steel-like fingers were inserted into his helmet. Snap! A drop of red blood dripped from the armored man's fingers and splashed on the ground. Ah! The Eastern Knight covered his bloody and empty eye sockets with both hands, raised his head and screamed. Before Marquis Vincent could react, he saw the armored man in front of him suddenly turn sideways. His right hand stretched out like a viper and instantly grabbed his throat. Marquis Vincent looked at the seemingly unkillable armored man in horror, his mind blank. Although his whole face was hidden in the armor, Marquis Vincent seemed to see the corner of his mouth grinning. Marquis Vincent, you have been captured again. Chapter 389. Although he had become a captive, Marquis Vincent still tried his best to straighten his back when he walked into the half-elven palace. However, in the eyes of outsiders, this kind of effort was always a bit weak in reality. Moreover, this was the second time Marquis Vincent walked into the palace as a captive. The unspeakable shame was like a poisonous snake biting into Marquis Vincent's heart. He couldn't help but wonder if Colin Angeli was destined to be his nemesis. He thought that this trip to Silver Moon City could wash away his shame, but he didn't expect that, when Marquis Vincent finally saw Colin in the palace, he was playing with the baby girl in his arms. When Colin saw Marquis Vincent and the others, he was ready to hand his daughter to a maid and send her to Aisha. However, the little girl seemed to like Colin very much. As soon as she left Colin's arms, she immediately burst into tears. Colin tried several times, but it didn't work. Colin was helpless, but he was also a bit smug. He could only hold his baby daughter and say to Marquis Vincent, "Sorry, the little girl is too clingy." Trisley looked at Colin with deep meaning and said with a smile, "Earl, Her Royal Highness likes the smell on your body." Marquis Vincent rolled his eyes and didn't say anything. From his point of view, Colin was purposely showing contempt for him. Colin paced in the palace and patted Sylph's back gently to calm her down. He then said to Marquis Vincent, "Marquis Vincent, we meet again." Colin was in a good mood, not only because he had caught a big fish like Marquis Vincent, but also because Marquis Vincent had sent 2 5th-grade knights over as well. These 2 5th-grade knights were already locked up by the Blood Cavalry, waiting for Colin to turn them into blood slaves. In this way, the strength of the Blood Shadow Guards under Colin's command increased greatly. Including the 2 5th-grade knights who were about to join, there were now 2 6th-grade knights, 4 5th-grade knights, and more than 300 professionals of other grades. A high-end combat force of this scale would not be inferior to any of the paladin clans with deep foundations. Of course, if this paladin family really had a living paladin, that would be a different story. What's more, Marquis Vincent was an important prisoner, so Colin could use him to exchange for a lot of good things from the eastern region. The corner of Marquis Vincent's mouth twitched, and he said disdainfully, "You're just lucky." Colin was amused. He pointed at Chui Silly and said, "Is this the blessing of the goddess of fate?" Trisley immediately said respectfully, "Yes, my lord. You, Her Majesty the Queen, and Princess Sylph are all people who are greatly favored by the goddess, and also the hope for the prosperity of the half-elven kingdom." Marquis Vincent sneered and said, "Colin, I advise you to be careful of this woman. She's a viper who doesn't keep her promises and bites the hand that feeds her. She has no sense of honor or bottom line. I really don't know how the goddess of destiny can have a believer like you." In the face of Marquis Vincent's slander, Chui Silly still looked indifferent, as if these accusations could not hurt her at all. Colin looked at Chui Silly with great interest, waiting for her to refute and explain, but unexpectedly, the High Priestess had no intention of speaking at all. For a moment, Colin could not figure out the High Priestess' intentions. However, he did not care too much. Since Chui Silly had helped Colin capture Marquis Vincent, then Colin would not pursue her previous mistakes. Of course, Colin would not trust this woman because of this, let alone agree to any of her conditions. It was like a piece of toilet paper, once used, it could be thrown away. Chui Silly did not know whether she did not realize that she was of no value in Colin's eyes and had accepted her fate, or whether she was confident in her ability to gain Colin's trust. In short, she still remained silent. However, Marquis Vincent was not willing to give up, and asked, "I promised this woman before the leadership of the whole half-elf kingdom, but she still betrayed me. So, Colin Angeli, what did you promise her?" Colin shrugged and said, "I did not promise anything." Marquis Vincent's face was full of disdain, as if he thought that Colin was lying. Unexpectedly, Chui Silly opened her mouth and said, "Yes. This is my gift to Count Angeli, and I do not ask for anything in return." "That's impossible." Marquis Vincent obviously could not accept this result. Chui Silly did not say anything, but she looked at Sylph in Colin's arms with bright eyes, as if that was the real reason why she changed her position and all that she wanted in return. Although Colin did not know what the High Priestess was planning, he did not ask any more, and instead asked Marquis Vincent, "Vincent, you are now my captive, so this time, what is the East going to give me to redeem you?" Marquis Vincent snorted and said, "What do you want?" Colin rubbed his chin, thought for a moment, and said, "I want 15 heavy warships, 180 light paddle sail warships, and 200 medium transport ships." Marquis Vincent heard this, and immediately laughed and said sarcastically, "Count Angeli, you want the House of St. Prospero to pack up the Pegasus Navy for you?" Colin shrugged and said with a smile, "I think you are the first successor of the Duke of the East, and if the price is too low, it will be an insult to you." "Oh, my father has 3 children who can inherit the title, but the House of St. Prospero only has 1 navy." Marquis Vincent spoke in a cold tone, "Count Angeli, what do you think my father will do?" Colin thought for a moment, and seemed to think that Marquis Vincent's words were reasonable, so he suggested, "How about this? You write a letter back and ask the Duke of St. Prospero how many warships he is willing to give you. But I have to remind you, if you don't have enough warships, I won't let you go easily." Marquis Vincent nodded stiffly. Colin saw this, and suddenly said again, "Oh, by the way, me Vincent, I remember that your brother, the Earl of Avon, is now at the northern frontier. Tell me, if he learns that you've been captured, will he try to stop you from being ransomed?" Marquis Vincent's mouth twitched a few times, and apparently he realized the crisis he was in. He immediately nodded and said, "I will write to my father as soon as possible, and ask him to give you a satisfactory price." "That's right." Colin smiled and nodded. At this time, he also found that Sylph in his arms had fallen asleep, so he generously lowered his head and kissed the little girl's forehead. "Okay, it's time for a nap, time to rest." After saying this, Colin turned around and walked into the hall with Sylph in his arms, no longer paying attention to Marquis Vincent and Trisley. Marquis Vincent looked at Chui Silly beside him and suddenly revealed a sinister smile, saying, "Chui Silly, I'll remember this debt. The House of St. Prospero won't let any traitor go easily." Trisley heard this, turned around calmly, and stared into Marquis Vincent's eyes without fear, and said calmly, "You don't represent the House of St. Prospero." This sentence seemed to have hit Marquis Vincent's soft spot, and his face instantly became extremely terrifying. But fortunately, he knew his current situation and didn't lose his temper. He only hid the hatred deep in his heart and growled, "Tricely, let's wait and see." Chapter 390. Duke Modwin, are you willing to surrender? Knight Roger urged his horse forward and asked expressionlessly. Yes, we are willing to surrender. Before Duke Modwin could say anything, his son, Charlie, scrambled to Knight Roger and begged. At this time, the Silvermoon Guards were already at the end of their rope. Other than surrendering, they had no other choice. Knight Roger glanced at Charlie but ignored him. He continued to look at Duke Modwin. Obviously, he felt that a child like Charlie could not make the decision. Duke Modwin was stunned. His eyes were dull and empty, as if he did not hear Knight Roger's question. Seeing this, Cames Modwin could only stand up and said in a trembling voice, "I'm sorry, Sir Knight. Duke Modwin is grieving over the death of a large number of his soldiers." Before he could finish, he was stuck, because a sharp sword had pierced through Cames' throat. Behind Camus, his nephew, Duke Modwin, who was immersed in grief, slowly pulled out his sword and let Camus' corpse fall to the ground. Then, Duke Modwin walked to Charlie, who was standing there in a daze without any expression on his face. Before Charlie could react to what had happened, Duke Modwin slit his own son's throat with his sword. Father, Knight Roger looked at the tragic scene in front of him with interest and did not stop it. However, when he saw Duke Modwin raising his sword towards his throat again, Knight Roger urged his horse forward and knocked the sword out of Duke Modwin's hand. "Duke Modwin, you can't die yet. The Count wants to see you." From what he said, he did not stop Duke Modwin from killing his uncle and son because Colin did not plan to see them. Duke Modwin looked like he had nothing left to live for. He did not speak, but he did not resist either. He probably thought of himself as a dead man and let them do whatever they wanted. Seeing this, Knight Roger waved his hand and gestured for the soldiers to subdue Duke Modwin. He then walked towards the half-elven palace. In the palace, Colin was changing into his formal attire with the help of the maids. The little fellow had sprayed some good stuff on his clothes just now, so he could only change them and wash them. Knight Roger led Duke Modwin into the hall and reported, "My lord, the rebellion of the Silvermoon Guard has been completely quelled. The mastermind, Duke Modwin, has been escorted to you." "Well done." Colin praised and waved his hand to signal the maid to leave. Then, he buttoned the last few buttons himself and walked up to Roger, asking, "How are the casualties?" "It is roughly estimated that the casualties of the bloody cavalry are about 400. I need further verification for more detailed statistics." Colin nodded with satisfaction. The casualties were not large. It seemed that the bloody cavalry had a terrible fighting capacity even if they could not play the advantage of cavalry in the street battle, which made Colin very pleased. "All right, you can leave first. Maintain order in the city and find all the half-elves who participated in the rebellion." "Sir." After Knight Roger saluted and left, Colin turned to Duke Modwin. At this time, Duke Modwin's eyes were dull, and his whole body was exuding a lifeless aura. If it was not because of the blood connection between them, Colin would have thought that he was his blood slave. "William, Her Majesty the Queen is very disappointed in you." Duke Modwin did not respond. Colin waited for a moment. Seeing that he had no intention to speak, he continued. "When Her Majesty the Queen was about to give birth, she deliberately handed over the military and political power of Silvermoon City to you. To be honest, even I can't understand this trust." Hearing this, Duke Modwin's eyeballs finally moved, but he still did not speak. Colin did not care about the rudeness of the other party and continued. "I once advised her to give away part of the power to prevent some people with bad intentions from taking the opportunity to rebel. But Her Majesty the Queen firmly told me, my throne was given to me by William. If he wanted to take it back, he would not have given it away." Colin came to Duke Modwin's side and patted him on the shoulder. He said in a deep voice, "Her Majesty really treats you like her own son." Duke Modwin's face finally showed some expression. He opened his mouth and stammered a few times before hissing, "I have let Her Majesty down." Colin looked at Duke Modwin with bright eyes and asked seriously, "William, When you gave away the right to inherit the throne, were you already unwilling? Duke Modwin shook his head and said, "No, Count. Actually, I know that I am not talented. Even if I take the throne, I do not have the ability to lead the half-elven kingdom to prosperity. Therefore, when you asked me if I was willing to give the throne to my mother, I actually heaved a sigh of relief." "I believe you," Colin said sincerely, "and I also know that the reason you were involved in the rebellion was all because of your son, Charlie." Duke Modwin's eyes instantly turned red. Not sure if it was because he thought of his son, Charlie, that he had just killed with his own hands, or because he was touched by Colin's understanding and trust. Colin saw all of this and was slightly pleased. He said, "So, I have decided to give you another chance?" Duke Modwin shook his head and said, "I have let down Her Majesty's trust, and I am not worthy of your forgiveness. Now I only ask for death. Only then can I redeem my sins." "You want to die?" "Yes." Duke Modwin raised his head and stared into Colin's eyes. The determination in his eyes seemed unshakable. Colin pursed his lips and said, "Death is a release, but it is also an escape. If you really want to repay Her Majesty's trust and redeem your sins, you have to survive first." Duke Modwin still shook his head. "I'm sorry, Count. There is nothing left in this world for me to miss. Is that so?" Colin interrupted coldly, "You don't care about the House of Medea anymore?" Duke Modwin was suddenly stunned. He stammered for a while before he said in a low voice, "Since the House of Medea has made a mistake, they will naturally be at Her Majesty's disposal. I just hope that Her Majesty will spare the innocent people in the tribe for the sake of the past." "Innocent?" Colin smiled coldly. "You are all treason. How are you innocent? Even if Her Majesty wants to exterminate your tribe, no one will dare to say anything." Duke Modwin's face instantly turned pale. He trembled as he begged, "Count, please advise Her Majesty not to do so. Otherwise, she will leave a tyrannical reputation and destroy her benevolent image in the hearts of the half-elves." Colin snorted and said, "William, I just said that I can give you a chance to redeem yourself. Do you still want to die?" Duke Modwin hurriedly said, "Count, I am willing to accept this chance. No matter what Her Majesty or you ask of me, I will do my best to do it for you." Colin took a step forward and asked, "Even if you have to pay with your life?" Duke Modwin was stunned for a moment before he nodded firmly and said, "Count, I have always wanted to die. As long as Her Majesty is willing to give the House of Medea a way out, I am willing to die even if I have to die." Colin nodded with satisfaction and said, "Good. As long as you help me do one thing, the House of Medea will not be held accountable. Please tell me." Chapter 391. The afternoon sun shone through the window and into a side hall of the half-elven palace. The colorful spots of light formed a complicated and disorderly pattern on the white glazed rock floor. These patterns attracted Javier's attention. He stared at the ground seriously, as if he was trying to figure out some profound truth from these light shadows. Of course, although Javier was a legendary half-elf merchant in Silvermoon City, he didn't know much about the principles of geometry. The only reason he was staring at these patterns was because he was too bored. After the rebellion of the Silvermoon Guards was quelled, the half-elven merchants who had set fire to the granary were naturally invited to the palace one by one. They had been sitting here for half a day, but Queen Aisha and Count Angeli still did not ask for them. This caused the half-elf merchants to be in a state of anxiety and fear. However, as time passed, their emotions gradually became numb. They began to calm down and think hard about what they should do next to obtain the Queen's forgiveness. "Excuse me, can we have some water?" A half-elf merchant could not help but ask the guards in the hall with a hoarse voice. However, it was as if the armored guards did not hear him at all. They did not even respond to his request. Havel was about to open his mouth, but he saw a handsome young man walking into the hall. "Count Angeli." The half-elf stood up and bowed to him. Colin walked to the main seat and sat down. He waved his hand and asked the others to sit down as well. The young half-elf maids walked into the hall quietly and served wine to everyone. The overflowing aroma of the wine made the half-elf merchants who had been thirsty for half a day swallow their saliva. However, they didn't dare to touch the red wine before Colin raised his glass. Colin glanced at the half-elves. Perhaps they were feeling guilty, but none of the half-elves dared to look him in the eyes. "Gentlemen, I invited you here because I want to ask you a question on behalf of the Queen." Colin opened his mouth. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. "Why did you set the granary on fire?" It was a difficult question to answer. The hall fell into an awkward silence. The half-elf merchants wanted nothing more than to bury their heads in their chests. They didn't even dare to breathe loudly for fear of attracting Colin's attention and being called out by him. Colin didn't seem to be in a hurry. He lifted the goblet in front of him and spun it gently in his hand. The dark red wine collided back and forth in the goblet, forming a small vortex. The fragrance of the wine spread out and constantly stimulated the sensitive nerves of the half-elf merchants. Javier glanced at Colin from the corner of his eye. The young Count of the Empire was observing the swirls in the wine cup with great interest. There was a faint smile on his handsome face, as if he were an ordinary young man who was gentle and curious. However, he didn't dare to treat Colin as a harmless young noble. This Count of the Empire was an old acquaintance of the half-elf merchant, and he knew Colin's rise like the back of his hand. That was a path of advancement paved with corpses and blood. "Javier." Colin didn't know if he had noticed Javier's gaze, but he directly called out the half-elf legendary merchant's name. "Sir Count." Javier stood up abruptly, as if he was a naughty student who was called out by the teacher in class. The rest of the half-elf merchants saw this and heaved a sigh of relief. Only Javier stood there stiffly. Cold sweat poured out like spring water, instantly drenching the front of his robe. Colin smiled faintly and asked, "Mr. Javier, please answer Her Majesty's question." If he could turn back time, Javier swore to God that he wouldn't have peeked. But now, he could only bite the bullet and answer, "Sir Count, it's because Marquis Vincent from the eastern region forced us to do this." Colin's expression didn't change. He was still gentle and refined, but in Javier's eyes, that face was no different from the devil's. Before Colin could continue asking, Javier hurriedly added, "But Sir Count, don't worry. We were already prepared. Before burning the granary, we secretly replaced most of the food with hay. So, even if the granary is burned, most of the food is still there. As long as you don't hold us accountable, I'm willing to sell the food to you at the lowest price." After Javier finished speaking, the rest of the half-elf merchants started to clamor. "Yes, Sir Count, I also hid the food in advance." "Me too, Sir Count, and I'm also willing to sell it to you at a low price." "My Lord Count, me too." Colin heard this and instantly laughed. He didn't know if he was happy that there was still food in stock, or if he was laughing at how crafty these half-elf merchants were. Of course, this wasn't surprising. If these half-elf merchants really burned the food that they had painstakingly stored, it would be worse than killing them. "Very good." Colin nodded in satisfaction, and the hall instantly quietened down. When the half-elf merchants saw the smile on Colin's face, the huge rock in their hearts finally fell. But just as they were rejoicing that they had escaped a calamity, Colin suddenly retracted his smile and coldly said, "However, your actions are in fact treason." "Sir Count, we were also forced." The merchants were still crying. "Forced?" Colin sneered. "Then why didn't you report it? Instead, you chose to follow the orders of the rebel army?" The half-elf merchants were instantly speechless. Javier hurriedly took the initiative to say, "Sir Count, we were indeed muddle-headed and made a foolish choice. If you're willing to forgive our mistakes, I'm willing to give you all the food for free." As soon as this was said, the other half-elf merchants felt their hearts bleeding, but they had no choice but to quickly agree and express their willingness to give up their food for free. Colin's expression softened a little, and he said calmly, "That's not enough." Javier endured the pain in his heart and respectfully asked, "Sir Count, if you have any other orders, please feel free to speak." "Do you know the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company?" "Yes." Javier nodded. He already understood that Colin was preparing to forcefully integrate the half-elf business. Indeed, in the next moment, he heard Colin say, "Her Majesty and I have discussed for a long time, and we have decided to establish a half-elf foreign trade company." Hearing this, the half-elf merchants immediately felt anxious. They knew that what was coming would come in the end. But before they could say anything, they saw an attendant rush into the hall and report, "Sir Count, Mark Vincent has been assassinated." Colin stood up with a whoosh. He no longer cared about these half-elf merchants and immediately walked out with large strides. Only when his figure disappeared outside the hall did the half-elf merchants react. At the same time, they were inexplicably shocked. Something big had happened. If the first successor to the House of St. Prospero died in Silvery Moon City, the half-elf merchants looked at each other, using their eyes to communicate their thoughts. However, no one dared to break the oppressive silence. For a moment, they didn't know whether to rejoice in the misfortune of others or worry about the storm that was about to engulf Silvery Moon City. Chapter 392. Although he had become a captive, Marquis Vincent's treatment was definitely different from other captives. He wouldn't be locked up in a prison or a captive camp. Instead, he would live in the side hall of the half-elven palace. The side hall was heavily guarded, not only to prevent outsiders from entering, but also to prevent those inside from escaping. Of course, he wouldn't be lacking in food and drink, and there were also young and beautiful half-elven maids serving him. If he deliberately forgot that he was a captive, Marquis Vincent would even feel like he was on vacation. Perhaps it was because this wasn't the first time he had been captured, but Marquis Vincent's ability to adjust his mental state had greatly improved. This time, he wasn't as pained and resentful as before. He even maintained a calm mind and planned a plan to redeem himself. He first wrote a letter to his father, the Duke of St. Prospero, blaming his failure all on High Priestess Trisseli's betrayal. He made it clear that if it weren't for this crazy woman's incomprehensible betrayal, he would have successfully caused Queen Aisha's death in childbirth, plunged Silver Moon City into endless chaos, and even forced Colin Angelo to leave the half-elven kingdom. Of course, he also wrote down the price Colin proposed for his redemption. However, he also understood that the Duke of St. Prospero wouldn't really give up a fleet in exchange for him. Therefore, he also suggested that his father send an eloquent messenger to Silver Moon City to discuss a ransom condition that both sides could accept. After writing this letter, Marquis Vincent thought for a while and wrote another letter to Earl Hall. Earl Hall was an old earl in the eastern region. His family was quite powerful, and his daughter was married to Marquis Vincent. Therefore, Marquis Vincent wanted to ask for his help. After all, this time, the eastern region didn't have Marquis Garcia as a bargaining chip. If they wanted to redeem Marquis Vincent, they would have to pay a huge price. Just as Colin had reminded him, Marquis Vincent was indeed worried that his father wouldn't be willing to pay a huge price to redeem him, or that his good younger brother would make things difficult for him. However, Marquis Vincent wasn't too worried. After all, he was still the Marquis of the Eastern region in name, and the first successor to the throne of the Eastern region. For the sake of the House of St. Prospero's reputation, his father wouldn't allow Marquis Vincent to be imprisoned in Silver Moon City. Marquis Vincent also knew that his father already had the idea of replacing his successor. The engagement between his younger brother, the Earl of Avon, and the daughter of the Paladin of the San Lorenzo family, Prince Lexi, was a manifestation of this idea. Unfortunately, things didn't go according to Marquis Vincent's wishes. Prince Lacey actually killed his own uncle, Consul Leadham. This made Prince Lacey turn from a respected paladin of the Empire to an evil traitor who was despised by everyone overnight. This also caused the Earl of Avon's threat to Marquis Vincent to be greatly reduced. However, Marquis Vincent wouldn't let down his guard against his good younger brother, especially under such circumstances. His failure in Silver Moon City gave the Earl of Avon an excellent opportunity to turn things around. If the Earl of Avon used this opportunity to prevent him from returning to the Eastern region, or if he persuaded the Duke of St. Prospero to remove Vincent's identity as the successor to lower the price he had to pay, then it would be no different from the end of the world for Vincent. After writing the letter to Earl Hall, Marquis Vincent carefully considered it again before stuffing it into an envelope and sealing it with wax. Then, he got up and walked out of the study, preparing to hand the 2 letters to his attendants to send to the Eastern region. At this moment, Marquis Vincent suddenly noticed an old acquaintance walking into the courtyard under the escort of his guards. Duke Modwin, Marquis Vincent smiled and greeted the other party. He guessed that the other party must have been captured and came here, and felt a sense of sympathy for him. Marquis Vincent. Duke Modwin bowed respectfully to Marquis Vincent and lowered his head, as if he wasn't too happy to see Marquis Vincent. Marquis Vincent knew the reason why Duke Modwin was a little cold. After all, Duke Modwin didn't intend to participate in this rebellion. It was only because his son Charlie was bewitched by someone that he had no choice but to join the rebellion. Now that he had fallen to such a state, Duke Modwin naturally wouldn't be nice to see the mastermind of this rebellion. After handing the 2 letters to his guards, Marquis Vincent pretended to be friendly and patted Duke Modwin's shoulder, smiling. "I didn't expect the 2 of us to become neighbors." Duke Modwin forced a smile and nodded, but didn't reply. "But are you blaming me for dragging you into this?" "I wouldn't dare." Marquis Vincent could tell that Duke Modwin was insincere, but he didn't care. He smiled and invited him. Come sit in my house. Things aren't as bad as you think." Duke Modwin didn't resist this time, and followed Marquis Vincent into the house. Marquis Vincent personally poured a cup of coffee for Duke Modwin. This polite gesture seemed to have finally moved Duke Modwin, and he asked sincerely, "Mar Vincent, you just said that things aren't as bad as you think. Do you have any way to get the House of Medea out of its current misfortune?" Marquis Vincent smiled faintly, and said in an extremely confident tone, "William, don't worry. Queen Aisha wouldn't dare to kill you. Her throne was given to her by you. If she killed you, wouldn't she be known as an ungrateful person? The punishment for you this time is probably just a demotion in rank." Demotion in rank? Only? When Duke Modwin heard this, for some reason, he thought of his son and uncle that he had killed with his own hands. While his heart was bleeding, he didn't show it on his face. He just picked up the coffee, took a sip, and asked, "Then do we still have a chance for revenge?" "Of course." Marquis Vincent laughed heartily, and seemed to be very satisfied with Duke Modwin's drive. This time, Aisha and Colin have forcefully suppressed the rebellion in the country, but they haven't resolved the most fundamental conflict. Aisha still can't represent the interests of the half-elves. She's just a puppet supported by the northern frontier. As long as this doesn't change, Silvery Moon City will be a fertile land for rebellion. We just need a little guidance, and there will be another rebellion. Seeing Duke Modwin's eyes flashing, Marquis Vincent thought that he had understood his thoughts. He came in front of him, put his hand on his shoulder, and confided in him. "William, in the eyes of the Eastern region, only the House of Medea is the legitimate half-elven royal family. That Aisha Miller is just a puppet pushed up by the northern frontier. Believe me, when we make a comeback in the future, we'll definitely help you to the half-elven throne. Thank you for your trust." Duke Modwin was so emotional that his face was flushed red. He quickly got up and bowed to Marquis Vincent. Marquis Vincent laughed as he looked at Duke Modwin, who bowed to him. He was pleased with himself. Just as he was about to say a few more words of encouragement, he suddenly felt a pain in his waist. "You," Duke Modwin raised his head, and his face had already changed into a ferocious smile. "Do you Eastern region people think that you're the savior of the half-elves? Unfortunately, in my eyes, you're just a demon who completely destroyed our peaceful lives for your own selfish interests." "Bastard!" Marquis Vincent kicked Duke Modwin away, and then covered the wound on his waist. He rushed out of the room and roared, "Someone come quickly! William Modwin has gone mad." However, before the guards outside the hall could arrive, Marquis Vincent felt that a strong aura had locked onto him. It seemed that if he made any strange movements, a thunderous attack would be launched. Save! Before Marquis Vincent's cry for help, Duke Modwin rushed from behind and stabbed the dagger into his chest once again. Seeing Marquis Vincent slowly fall to the ground, Duke Modwin raised the bloody dagger and laughed to the sky. He did not hide the joy of getting his revenge. "This is your retribution." The guards outside the hall quickly rushed over, but before they could, Duke Modwin slit his own throat without any hesitation. The guards looked at the tragic scene in front of them and were stunned for a moment. Until someone woke up from his dream and roared, "Quick! Quickly inform the Earl." Chapter 393. Why was Duke Modwin able to bring a dagger in? Colin asked with a gloomy face as he looked at the bloody assassination scene in front of him. The guards looked at each other and finally fixed their eyes on a warrior who was fully covered in armor. They knew that it was Count Angeli's personal guard who personally searched Duke Modwin's body, but they did not know if it was because of his carelessness or Colin also noticed the gazes of the guards and raised his head to look at his personal guard. The personal guard's face was hidden behind the thick armor and no one could see his expression clearly. However, when he saw Colin looking at him, he immediately knelt down on one knee and raised his sword high above his head. Although he did not say anything, his attitude meant that he was guilty. Colin looked coldly at the personal guard. He hesitated for a moment, but perhaps he thought of the serious consequences of this matter. In the end, he steeled his heart and took the personal guard's sword, plunging it straight into his chest. The personal guard screamed in pain and his head tilted to the side. He was no longer breathing. Colin waved his hand dispiritedly and said, "All of you are dismissed. No one is allowed to speak of what happened here." When only Colin was left in the courtyard, the anger on his face disappeared. The personal guard who was killed stood up again and ignored the sword that pierced through his chest. He took off his helmet and revealed a weather-beaten middle-aged face. He still did not say anything and just stood by the side quietly. Colin bent down and touched Marquis Vincent's pulse. He found that there was still a trace of life in this person, but it was quickly fading away. Therefore, he did not hesitate and immediately lowered his head to bite Marquis Vincent's neck. Gulp, wisps of blood-red smoke rose and formed a mysterious and profound pattern between Colin and Marquis Vincent. As the blood-red light flashed, an ancient and strange ritual was in progress. After a long time, Colin raised his head and let out a long breath. He then had the time to check on Duke Modwin and found that this person was completely dead. This former half-elf prince was truly an honest person. Even in death, he had died so thoroughly. Perhaps William Modwin had already decided to die. Colin lowered his head and observed a moment of silence for this person. Then he saw Marquis Vincent's finger move slightly. Seeing this, he hurriedly turned his head and gave a look. The personal guard who had been standing at the side with a sword in his chest immediately fell to the ground and pretended to be a corpse. "What's wrong with me?" Marquis Vincent got up in a daze, as if he had not figured out what was going on. "You're already dead," Colin said indifferently. Marquis Vincent was stunned. He looked at Colin and then at the corpse of Duke Modwin beside him. He finally came to his senses and said anxiously, "Count Angeli. This William Modwin wants to kill me." After a few quick breaths, Marquis Vincent discovered the two frightening wounds on his chest and waist. He was just about to ask Colin to find a doctor to treat him when he realized that these two wounds didn't seem to be too serious. There was no bleeding, no pain, as if the two wounds were just an illusion. "What's wrong with me?" Colin smiled and reminded him again, "Didn't I tell you that you're already dead?" Marquis Vincent's face stiffened, and he said embarrassedly, "Count Angeli, please don't joke about this." "I'm not joking," Colin said seriously, "you're already dead. I gave you a second life." Marquis Vincent opened his mouth, but did not say anything. If it was in the past, if someone dared to say such words to him, Marquis Vincent would have slapped them to wake them up. But now, in the face of Colin's arrogant words, Marquis Vincent fell into deep thought. This was because he realized that the Colin in front of him was emitting an inexplicable aura. It was an irresistible power and holiness, and he could not help but have the urge to worship him from the bottom of his heart. Although the bone-deep hatred for Colin was still there, it was firmly suppressed by an even stronger sense of reverence in the depths of his heart. Moreover, Marquis Vincent had an inexplicable premonition that his life was in the hands of Colin. He could easily let him live, and he could also easily let him die. The enemy of his life was now the master of his own fate. "What did you do to me?" Marquis Vincent was suddenly plunged into endless fear. "I gave you a second life," Colin said in a grand and chanted tone. All of a sudden, Marquis Vincent seemed to have realized something. Following that, his expression changed completely. It was as if he had been inspired by the god of light. The fear and suspicion on his face gradually disappeared, and in its place was boundless reverence and devotion. You are the apostle of my Lord, the chosen one. That's right. Colin's face was full of sincerity, and he started to bluff. I came to the world under the orders of my Lord to investigate the matter of the transmission channel of faith being cut off. At the same time, I was ordered to clean up the corrupted upper echelons of the church. Now that Colin knew many secrets of the Church of Light, he naturally began to upgrade his brainwashing declaration. Normally, Marquis Vincent would definitely not believe such nonsense, but after experiencing the miracle of life and death and discovering that Count Angeli was emitting an irresistible holy light, Marquis Vincent had no choice but to believe it. Thus, the Marquis of the Eastern region immediately crawled on the ground, kissing Colin's toes, and said in an incomparably sincere tone, "The Almighty God of Light. You did not abandon the most pious and humble believer after all. May your glory reappear, illuminate all things in the world, and sweep away all evil." Colin blinked his eyes. He was clearly surprised that the effect of this speech was so good. Just as he was in a daze, Marquis Vincent raised his head and said in a clear voice, "Lord God's chosen one, what is my Lord's plan? Please tell me, I will do my best to help you complete it." Colin touched the tip of his nose and said indifferently, "I can't tell you my Lord's plan yet. If you are still loyal to your faith, then listen to my arrangements." "Yes, Lord God's chosen one." Marquis Vincent agreed without hesitation. This made Colin even suspect that this guy found out that his life was in his hands, and was worried that Colin would settle old scores with him, so he deliberately put on such a respectful appearance. However, Colin did not continue to probe. After all, he could easily kill Marquis Vincent through bloodline suppression, but he still could not test whether the other party's loyalty was reliable. Unless he turned Marquis Vincent into a blood slave without self-awareness. But that would be too wasteful. As for Marquis Vincent, Colin had great use for him. Thus, Colin changed the topic and asked, "What was the assassination attempt from before?" Marquis Vincent pointed to the corpse of Duke Modwin beside him and replied, "It was William Modwin, this guy, who suddenly took out a dagger and wanted to kill me like a madman." "Oh, right, it wasn't just him, I also felt another aura, at least rank 5. At this point, Marquis Vincent suddenly noticed that there was another corpse on the ground. He was the personal guard that Colin had killed with his own hands. But when Marquis Vincent saw the face of the personal guard, he was suddenly stunned. Chapter 394. Vincent, you know him, don't you? He is a knight of the House of St. Prospero. When I led the Pegasus Legion to Silver Moon City last year, he also went with the army. Marquis Vincent's face was a little dignified. "So, after that battle, he swore allegiance to you?" Colin nodded and said, "Yes. Although I announced to the public that all the prisoners of war of the Pegasus Legion had been killed, it was only to appease the blood cavalry and the half-elves. In fact, there were many high-grade professionals in the Pegasus Legion who were willing to surrender, but I secretly kept them." Marquis Vincent was not surprised by this. After all, it would be a waste to kill such a high-grade professional like an ordinary captive. If he were Colin, he would do the same. Although these Eastern Knights who had changed their allegiance would be too ashamed to return to their hometown, it was better than dying. "This time, I ordered this person to be your guard mainly because he was from the Eastern region. I thought he would be more attentive to you, but I didn't expect him to plot to assassinate you. Could it be that he blamed the defeat of the Pegasus Legion and his own capture on you? No, if that was the case, it wouldn't be enough for this person to take the risk to assassinate me." Marquis Vincent's eyes flashed, as if he had understood the real reason for the matter. Colin frowned and asked, "Oh? Listening to what you said, could there be other reasons?" Marquis Vincent nodded with a dignified face and said, "Lord Chosen One, this person is called John Fine. Although he is a knight of the House of St. Prospero, he is actually from the Fine family. However, because he was born in a branch of the Fine family, he could not inherit the title. After showing his knightly talent, he chose to be loyal to the House of St. Prospero and has been following me since. But this person is a member of the Fine family after all, and the Fine family. They have been jumping around in the Eastern region recently." "Fine?" Colin touched his chin and pretended to think for a while before asking, "If I remember correctly, The Viscounts who recently appeared in Alfalfa City seems to be from the Fine family. That's right. That Viscount's Finn is his cousin, and the operation against Alfalfa City has always been the responsibility of my good younger brother, the Earl of Avon. Colin seemed to have suddenly realized something and said, "Could it be that the Fine family is a supporter of your younger brother, the Earl of Avon?" Yes. In fact, the Fine's family was originally a dutiful family. Although they weren't close to me, they didn't deliberately get close to Evan. But recently, they've probably seen Evan getting engaged to Prince Lacey's daughter. That's why they're starting to support Evan as the successor of the Duke of the Eastern region. Marquis Vincent said through gritted teeth. I didn't expect that they would actually dare to make a move on me. No, the Fines shouldn't have the guts. It must be my good brother, the Earl of Avon, who secretly instigated it. Looking at Marquis Vincent, who had imagined the truth, Colin was laughing inside, but on the surface, he immediately put on a vexed expression. It seems that I didn't understand the situation and appointed the wrong person. Sir God's chosen one, you don't have to blame yourself. Marquis Vincent hurriedly persuaded. In fact, if it weren't for your arrangement and exposing this person, I wouldn't have known that Evan could be so ruthless to take such measures against me for the sake of the inheritance. It's funny that I used to think that Evan was soft-hearted. Although he also wanted to inherit the position of the Duke of the Eastern region, he might not really dare to use the most extreme means. Now it seems that my good younger brother is really a person who can do great things. Colin looked at the ferocious Marquis Vincent and said with a smile, "Don't worry, since you've become my apostle, no one can take away the position of the Duke of the Eastern region from you." Marquis Vincent's spirit was lifted, and he hurriedly expressed his loyalty. "Thank you for your support, Sir God's chosen one. Please rest assured, no matter what plan my lord has for sending you to the world, I will do my best to assist you in accomplishing it." Colin nodded with satisfaction and said, "Well then, you first make a list of the half-elves who participated in this rebellion." Marquis Vincent answered without any hesitation. Then he went to the desk, picked up a quill, and started writing. A moment later, Colin took the list of rebels from Marquis Vincent and looked at it carefully. In fact, Knight Roger had also given Colin a list of half-elves who participated in the rebellion, but Marquis Vincent's list was obviously more rich. This was understandable after all, although many half-elven nobles originally agreed to participate in the rebellion, when it really came down to it, they might regret it, or they might be afraid, or they might want to wait for a while and let others go first. Then, when they saw that things weren't going well, they directly backed out. For example, the Savoy family. According to his maid Kathy's report, this half-elven royal family was actually inquiring about the doctor who delivered Aisha's baby. Obviously, they were up to no good, but during the rebellion, they didn't show up. Therefore, Knight Roger's list didn't include the Savoy family. However, Marquis Vincent's list included them. The Savoy family. Are you sure they participated in the rebellion? Colin asked. Yes, Baron Savoy personally participated in the secret meeting I organized. Obviously, he also had ulterior motives. Then, what plans did the Savoy family have? Marquis Vincent revealed a sarcastic smile and said, "My lord, that Baron Savoy actually wanted to bribe the doctor who delivered Her Majesty's baby. But in my opinion, this was obviously an extremely stupid move. The doctor who delivered Her Majesty's baby must have been carefully selected. How could he be so easily bribed? His plan would only alert the enemy. Therefore, I immediately rejected Baron Savoy's plan and only ordered him to follow the Silver Moon Guard." Colin nodded and said, "Obviously, he didn't do as you said." Marquis Vincent understood Colin's meaning and shrugged. "This isn't strange. There are always some self-righteous idiots in this world." Indeed. Colin glanced at Marquis Vincent and laughed. "Your plan to let Duke Muller and Madame Sharon take action is much smarter." Marquis Vincent was stunned when he heard this. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "My lord, I don't understand what you mean." Colin looked at Marquis Vincent seriously and asked, "You didn't arrange for Duke Muller and Madame Sharon?" Marquis Vincent shook his head. "Her Majesty Aisha is from the Miller family. Why would I take the risk to rope in Duke Muller and Madame Sharon to participate in the rebellion?" Colin frowned and hurriedly looked through the list of names that Marquis Vincent gave him. Indeed, he didn't find any members of the Miller family. He didn't think that Marquis Vincent was lying. After all, the rebellion had failed and there was no need to lie. Moreover, thinking about it carefully, Marquis Vincent had already persuaded the high priestess of the goddess of destiny to hold the blessing of blood ceremony to forcefully increase the bloodline of the fetus in Aisha's womb and cause a difficult birth. In that case, there was no need for Madame Sharon to poison Aisha with the energy potion. So, Madame Sharon and Duke Muller participated in the rebellion on their own accord? Colin thought about it and felt that it was possible. Although Duke Muller wasn't instigated by Marquis Vincent, he was probably planning to take advantage of the situation when he sensed the rebellion in Silvery Moon City. After all, if Aisha had an accident during the birth, Duke Muller would be the first in line to the throne. But then Colin recalled that when he exposed Duke Muller, the latter had admitted that he was bewitched by the Eastern region to participate in the rebellion. Under those circumstances, Duke Muller had no need to lie. Colin frowned and realized that there might be some hidden information that he had overlooked. Seeing that Colin was silent, Marquis Vincent quickly asked, "Sir, is there something wrong?" "Just a small problem." Colin smiled and shook his head. He didn't think too much about it and prepared to personally interrogate Madame Sharon later. He put away the list of rebels that Marquis Vincent had given him and said, "Next, I need you to cooperate with me." Marquis Vincent immediately lowered his head and placed his hand on his chest. "It's my greatest honor to be able to serve the Chosen One." Chapter 395. Cough cough, can we drink this wine now? In the hall of the palace, a half-elf merchant asked with a hoarse voice. They were invited here by Count Angeli, but Marquis Vincent was assassinated before they could finish their conversation. After Count Angeli left, the half-elf merchants looked at the red wine in front of them and couldn't hold back anymore. But even so, no one dared to touch the wine first. "Just take a sip and drink a little. It shouldn't be a problem," someone suggested. Although the person suggested this, he didn't touch the wine himself. There was another awkward silence. Finally, Javier couldn't hold it in any longer. Under the surprised gazes of the bystanders, he downed the wine in front of him in one gulp. "Where's the maid? Please fill my glass." However, the awkward thing was that no maid came in at all. Havel snorted and stood up immediately. But just as he was about to leave, the armored guard standing by the side immediately stepped forward and stopped him. Javier didn't dare to break in, so he said politely, "I just want a maid to fill my glass." But the guards didn't say anything, they just stood in front of Javier. Javier couldn't hold back his anger anymore. He shouted, "We've been sitting here for half a day, can't we just have some wine to quench our thirst? Is this how the palace treats its guests?" As soon as he finished speaking, a cold voice came from outside the hall. "How the palace treats its guests? Mr. Javier, do you think you're a guest?" Javier heard this familiar voice and froze on the spot. The half-elf merchants looked at Colin striding into the hall. They were gloating about Javier's misfortune, but they were also worried about their own fate. At the same time, they were even more curious about whether the assassination attempt on Marquis Vincent had succeeded. If Marquis Vincent really died in Silver Moon City, the East region would definitely not let it go. Unfortunately, Colin's expression when he came in was the same as when he left. He was calm and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. The half-elf merchants couldn't find any clues from his expression. Colin walked past Javier without looking at him. He sat down on the main seat and interrupted the stammering Javier. "In my eyes, you are criminals who participated in the rebellion, not guests. Which one of you still doesn't understand your situation?" Colin glanced around, and when he saw that no one dared to look at him, he turned back to Javier. "Mr. Javier, do you have any comments on my previous proposal?" "I think the Count's suggestion is very reasonable. Us half-elves need a unified foreign trade organization to avoid unnecessary internal disputes." Javier quickly praised Colin's suggestion, hoping to get rid of the bad impression that his rash behavior had left on Colin. He also understood that regardless of whether the half-elf merchants were willing or not, Colin would not allow them to escape his control. The establishment of the half-elf foreign trade company was unstoppable. So, since they couldn't resist, they should be more straightforward and take the initiative. Maybe they could win some impression points and even get a good position in the half-elf business circle that was about to usher in a big reshuffle. Sure enough, Colin was very satisfied with this tactful half-elf merchant. The indifference on his face eased a little. He glanced around the rest of the half-elf merchants and asked, "What about the others? Do you have any comments?" At this time, the rest of the half-elf merchants naturally didn't dare to speak out, and they all expressed their agreement. Good. Then it's decided. Colin clapped his hands, stood up, picked up the wine glass in front of him, and said loudly, "Let's toast together to celebrate the establishment of the half-elf foreign trade company." Ding ding ding. In the crisp sound of glasses clinking, the half-elf merchants drank the red wine in the glass with a smile on their faces, but their hidden feelings were particularly complicated. After the chaos, Silvermoon City regained its peace. But the trauma left by the rebellion couldn't be removed in a short time. The streets were full of patrolling blood cavalry teams. The bodies of the rebels who died in the battle had been cleaned up, but the bodies of the half-elf nobles who participated in the rebellion were still hung in the central square of the city. When the people of Silvermoon City passed by here, they couldn't help but steal a few glances at the old men who were usually high up in the sky. They were frightened, but there was also an indescribable pleasure in their hearts. This political storm was just a nightmare for the ordinary half-elves. They didn't care too much about who won and who lost. They just wanted to live a peaceful life. In a luxurious villa in the business district of Silvermoon City, Javier was welcoming a few half-elf merchants he was familiar with into the living room. After a few greetings, they all fell into silence. Seeing the atmosphere gradually become awkward, Javier, as the host, coughed lightly and said, "I have received accurate news that Marquis Vincent has been assassinated." "What? Are you sure?" "Yes." Javier nodded with a gloomy face. "He was killed by Duke Modwin." "Duke Modwin?" The other half-elf merchants looked at each other. They all found it hard to believe the news. Seeing this, Javier explained, "My guess is that Duke Modwin felt that Marquis Vincent had used some underhanded means to forcefully involve himself in the rebellion. Hence, with hatred in his heart, he took the opportunity when the two of them were locked up together to assassinate Marquis Vincent." "That's possible. Also, I sent someone to carefully observe Duke Modwin's body in the city square. His body was obviously more rotten than the other half-elf nobles' bodies. This means that Duke Modwin was already dead before he was executed. I also heard that after Duke Modwin killed Marquis Vincent in the palace, he knew that he couldn't survive, so he killed himself on the spot. That's why he died earlier than the other half-elf nobles." The half-elf merchants all nodded. They believed that Javier's news was true. "So, Mr. Javier, what should we do? Since Marquis Vincent died in Silvermoon City, the Eastern region will definitely not let this go. Should we still follow Count Angeli's request and establish a foreign trade company?" Javier sneered and said with disdain, "Do we have a choice now?" This time, no one said anything. Indeed, even if the Eastern region wanted to avenge Marquis Vincent, Silvermoon City was still under Count Angeli's control. Killing a group of disobedient half-elf merchants was no different than swatting a few flies. Javier saw the expressions on their faces and said, "But, it's not like we can't do anything. Mr. Javier, what do you think? Do you all trust me?" Javier didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked in a deep voice, "Of course we trust you. You have always been the leader of the half-elf business." "Yes, Mr. Javier, we can only rely on you now." Hearing the praises from the crowd, Javier had a proud expression on his face. However, he immediately waved his hand and said, "Since you all trust me, then I'll just say it. I think that if we want to maintain the independence of the half-elf business, we must seek outside help. Otherwise, we will not be able to fight against Queen Aisha and Count Angeli alone. Mr. Javier, the outside help you mentioned, who is it?" "The Eastern region, of course." "The Eastern region?" Javier said with confidence, "The news of Marquis Vincent's death is still sealed. Obviously, Queen Aisha and Count Angeli don't want the Eastern region to know the news so soon. But if we secretly spread the news? A half-elf merchant thought about the possible chaos and couldn't help but shiver. He said, if the eastern region really sends troops again, won't our businesses be damaged again? Idiot! Javier scolded without holding back. Only when the eastern region and the northern frontier fight can we have a chance to profit from both sides. Now, we can only be slaughtered by Count Angeli. But will the eastern region really send troops to Silver Moon City? Someone asked worriedly. After all, the destruction of the Sky Horse Legion was just around the corner. The House of St. Prospero might not send troops to help Marquis Vincent. Javier smiled calmly and said, we need to do something to force the Duke of St. Prospero to send troops. The crowd was excited and quickly asked, what should we do? Chapter 396. When did she die? Colin looked expressionlessly at Madame Sharon's corpse in front of him, anger rising in his heart. Unlike the assassination of Marquis Vincent, this assassination was obviously not directed by Colin. Of course, Colin did not feel sad about this person's death. Although she was Aisha's biological mother, Colin had already sentenced her to death in his heart when she was about to poison Aisha when she gave birth. The reason why he did not kill her on the spot was that he wanted to leave it to Aisha to deal with her personally. But he did not expect that Madame Sharon would also be assassinated. Even if she had to die, she should have died at the hands of Aisha. Count, Madame Sharon died from poisoning. According to the degree of stiffness of the corpse, the time of death was about last night. Colin nodded and fell into silence. He did not check who had come to Madame Sharon's room last night because it would be meaningless. After exposing Madame Sharon's conspiracy, Colin did not pay attention to this person and just casually placed her in a side hall of the palace. This could not be blamed on Colin's carelessness. After all, he did not feel the need to arrange a heavy guard for this person at first. First of all, Madame Sharon was not a professional and it was impossible for her to escape from the heavily guarded palace. Moreover, after killing Duke Muller, Madame Sharon's life and death were no longer important. A weak woman like her could not cause any trouble after losing Aisha's trust. But when Colin learned that Marquis Vincent did not instigate Duke Muller to participate in the rebellion, he realized that there was something wrong with Duke Muller's motives and that Madame Sharon might be useful. Unfortunately, he realized it too late. When he wanted to interrogate Madame Sharon, she was already dead. However, Colin also confirmed one thing. There must be someone behind Duke Muller and Madame Sharon. Before, Colin had speculated that Duke Muller might have seen the rebellion and wanted to take advantage of the chaos. But now, looking at the silenced Madame Sharon, Colin understood that they were instigated by someone. Moreover, this person did not want to reveal his identity. This was a bit interesting. Colin touched his chin and fell into deep thought. It seemed that there was another force besides the eastern region that wanted to cause chaos in the half-elven kingdom. Who could it be? In the back garden of the palace, Queen Elsa was wearing a loose white robe. She was holding Sylph, who was still sleeping soundly, as she strolled on the green lawn. Her beautiful and charming face shone with the radiance of happiness. Her amber eyes were filled with tenderness and love as she stared at the baby girl in her arms. The soft autumn sun shone on the mother and daughter, as if they were rippling with a holy halo. Behind Aisha, there were two little tails, Prince Harrison and Princess Judy. The two followed behind Aisha, curiously looking at the little life in her arms. They whispered a few words from time to time, and then covered their mouths and laughed. No one knew what they were talking about. Hearing Colin's footsteps, Aisha stopped, turned back and smiled sweetly at her lover. Her voice was clear and soft. You came at a bad time. The little one just fell asleep. Colin walked up, put his arm around Aisha's waist and asked, Why did you get out of bed? Didn't I tell you to rest for a while? Aisha leaned her body into Colin's arms and said with a smile, It's uncomfortable to lie down all the time, and I'm very healthy. It's no problem for me to get up and walk around. Colin also knew that Aisha's body was not comparable to that of an ordinary pregnant woman, so he didn't try to persuade her anymore. He lowered his head and kissed the delicate face of the little one in her arms. Humph! Teacher, you're really not afraid that the whole world will know that Sylph is your illegitimate daughter? Princess Judy couldn't help but grumble. Colin glanced at Judy with a smile and asked, "What about your father? Do you know how many illegitimate children he has?" Princess Judy suddenly stopped talking and puffed up her cheeks angrily. Even Colin, who was not familiar with the noble circle in the capital, knew that Emperor Reinhardt's illegitimate children were all over the capital. Some people even joked that Emperor Reinhardt didn't have to worry about the issue of an heir. If something happened to his children, he could choose one of the many illegitimate children to adopt. Colin sometimes couldn't help but wonder if this was the reason why Emperor Reinhardt was willing to send Harrison and Judy to him without worrying about anything happening to them. Father has 9 illegitimate children and 7 illegitimate daughters. A young voice said weakly. Colin turned around in surprise and looked at Prince Harrison. He smiled and said, "You know so much?" Prince Harrison nodded solemnly and said, "Yes, even father's illegitimate children are clearly recorded in the royal family." Colin suddenly became interested and asked, "Then how are you sure that the child is Emperor Reinhardt's? After all, I heard that your father's lovers are all married women." "Every lover of my father's would be placed in a specific manner during the period of time when they were being pampered and wouldn't have any contact with their husbands. Your father is really a particular person." Colin couldn't help but laugh. But then he immediately realized that Emperor Reinhardt was deliberately sowing his seeds. Such a strict and perfect security system, and the situation of every illegitimate child was recorded in detail. Was Emperor Reinhardt's behavior of having lovers all over the capital purely for pleasure, or did he have other motives? Thinking of the golden-tailed butterfly, the Morrison family, on the northern frontier, Colin suddenly felt that this Emperor Reinhardt wasn't secretly doing some kind of bloodline experiment under the guise of having lovers everywhere, was he? Thinking of this, Colin said to Prince Harrison, "Harrison, do you still remember the details of your father's illegitimate children?" Prince Harrison scratched his head and said awkwardly, "I only remember part of it." "Then please write down the information you remember. I want to take a look. These shouldn't be confidential, right?" "Of course not. I'll write it down now and show it to you when I'm done." Prince Harrison nodded and then ran off as if he had received an important mission. "What about me? What about me? Do I have a mission?" Princess Judy felt that she had been left out and shouted unhappily. Colin rolled his eyes and said with a smile, "Help me design an amusement park." "Amusement park?" "Yes, this is an amusement park for Sylph. Please help me design it. It will be based on the adventures of the heroes I told you before, combined with exploration, mazes, riddles, treasure hunting, and other elements, and create a few mini-games that can be used to clear the game. If your design is good, I can gather craftsmen to cooperate with you to build this amusement park." "Okay, but I'll design it." Princess Judy was so excited that she clapped her hands and shouted loudly. It wasn't until the little girl in Aisha's arms woke up that she stuck out her cute tongue and ran off. Aisha patted Sylph's back gently and waited for her to fall asleep again before saying to Colin, "All right, that's enough. You sent the 2 of them away. Do you have anything to say to me?" Colin's smile faded as he held Aisha's soft, jade-like hand and said in a deep voice, "Madame Sharon has passed away." Chapter 397. "Mother," a hint of sadness flashed in Aisha's eyes, but it quickly disappeared. However, Colin was still sharp enough to notice it. No matter how Madame Aisha treated Aisha before, even if she tried to murder her, she was still Aisha's biological mother. "How did Mother die?" Aisha tried to keep her voice as calm as water, but it only showed that her heart was not calm. "She was poisoned to death." Colin sighed and said, "I have sent someone to investigate the people who may have been in your mother's room last night, but I'm afraid there may not be any results." Aisha nodded and understood what Colin meant. She also knew that the 2 of them did not pay much attention to Madame Sharon's security. After all, they did not expect that someone would come to kill Madame Sharon. At this time, Aisha also realized that something was wrong and asked, "Why would someone want to kill Mother?" The rebellion planned by the Eastern region did not include Duke Muller and Madame Sharon. Colin only said one sentence, but Aisha understood the key point and immediately said, "Mother was killed." "So, other than the Eastern region, there is another force in Silver Moon City?" Colin nodded and asked, "Have you been paying attention to the Miller family recently? Do you know which force they may have been in contact with?" Aisha thought for a moment and asked, "Colin, do you know Mother's background?" Seeing Colin shake his head, Aisha continued, "Actually, Mother's surname should be St. Hilda." "What? St. Hilda?" Colin was shocked. "Strictly speaking, Mother is the aunt of the Dukes of the North. Why have I never heard Vera mention it?" "Because her mother was an illegitimate daughter, and she was the offspring of the Duke of St. Hilda 2 generations ago and a half-elf of a different race. Therefore, his mother never dared to claim that she was a descendant of the House of St. Hilda, and the House of St. Hilda would never publicly acknowledge her existence. However, even if she is a lowly illegitimate daughter, her mother still has the noble bloodline of the Holy Knight family flowing in her body. Human nobles might look down on her, but in the eyes of us half-elves, she is still noble. That's why she married my father." Colin nodded as he suddenly realized something. No wonder the previous Duke of St. Hilda wanted to marry Vera to Prince Tup. At that time, the Miller family was so eager to facilitate this marriage. It turns out that there is such a relationship between the two families. Your Miller family has a close relationship with the House of St. Hilda. You can even be considered a branch of the House of St. Hilda. Yes. Aisha continued, "At the end of last year, when Queen Medela came to Silvery Moon to coronate me, she was also very affectionate with the Miller family, especially my mother. At that time, I didn't think much about it. I thought that their intimacy was only because of this bloodline connection." Queen Medela? When Colin heard this name, he immediately narrowed his eyes and fell into deep thought. Although Queen Medela had already formed an alliance with Colin in Imperial Dragon City and decided to fight against the forces of the church together, Colin was not naive enough to think that Queen Medela would really think of her allies in all aspects and not hide anything. When Aisha was coronated last year, Queen Medela coveted the half-elf kingdom and tried to sow discord between Queen Aisha and Colin. Fortunately, the relationship between Aisha and Colin was not as simple as Queen Medela thought. But Queen Medela might not give up so easily. Now it seems that Duke Miller and Madame Sharon may be the spies she left behind. Aisha looked at Colin and asked, "You suspect Queen Medela?" "It's possible." Colin nodded and muttered, "She can't wait for me to fight to the death with the East, so she has enough motive. If Madame Sharon was not exposed and you had an accident, I would just put the blame on the East who started the rebellion. Maybe I would have sent my army to the East in a fit of anger." "That makes sense. Then should I send someone to interrogate the other members of the Miller family? Maybe I can get something out of them." "You can try, but even Madame Sharon has been killed. I presume that even if the Miller family still has contacts over there, they would have been eliminated. Well, I also want to take this opportunity to reorganize the Miller family. I can't let the same thing happen again." "Okay." Colin nodded, his eyes flashing with a cold light. "This time, don't be merciful. Clean up all the hidden dangers and suspicious people. We can't keep being distracted by the rebellion in the half-elf kingdom." "I understand." While talking, the two came to the artificial lake in the backyard of the palace. The lakeside was filled with red maple trees. When the late autumn wind blew gently, the flame-like maple leaves fell one by one, dancing lightly in the blue sky and green water until they could not resist the temptation of gravity and fell onto the surface of the lake. A white gull swept across the lake and picked up a white-bellied finned fish, causing the other birds to fight for the food. Colin naturally took Aisha into his arms and rested his chin on her head, smelling the fragrance of her hair. He was immersed in the picturesque scenery, enjoying the time alone with his lover and beloved daughter. At this moment, all the schemes had disappeared. Colin also did not think about the complicated conflicts of interest in Silver Moon City. Sometimes, Colin even wanted to leave everything behind and only bring the people he loved to a faraway place to live in seclusion. Of course, this thought only flashed through Colin's mind for a moment before it was tossed to the back of his mind. After all, Colin was not stupid. He knew that this was just an unrealistic thought. If he really lost his title, territory, and army, what awaited him would not be freedom, but imprisonment or even death. Strength was the foundation of his footing in this world. Unless he could learn from the elves and seal off the entire forest, completely cutting off all contact with the outside world. But even the elves would not be able to continue living in seclusion. The mysterious prophecy of the Savoy family, the strange actions of High Priestess Trisley, and the appearance of the Phoenix bloodline in Sylph seemed to indicate that the elves were not far from reappearing in the world. Once the seal of the Radiant Moon Forest was opened, Colin was not sure what kind of impact it would have on the current situation of this world. But he knew that he was destined to be involved. So before this, Colin had to stabilize his own base, the northern frontier and the half-elf kingdom. As for the eastern region, he did not have any plans to send troops in a short period of time. After all, with the natural moat of the raging water river, sending troops was always a bad idea. Moreover, what the northern frontier needed now was rest and recuperation. Continuing to be militaristic would only consume the war potential of the northern frontier. In the end, both sides would suffer losses in the battle with the eastern region, which would benefit the royal family. But not sending troops did not mean that Colin could not do anything to the eastern region. Chapter 398. At the end of October, following the end of the autumn harvest, the citizens of Icestone City welcomed the annual Harvest Festival. Although the spring plowing was delayed once again due to the chaos of war in the northern frontier in the first half of this year, it was fortunate that the slave rebellion in Icestone City had been quelled early on by Count Angeli, so the spring plowing wasn't affected too much. Also, in the war against the Troll Empire, Count Angeli won a great victory and forced the trolls to send over a large number of young and strong slaves. With the help of these troll slaves, Icestone City's spring plowing, autumn harvest, irrigation works, city defense construction, and so on were all progressing smoothly. In addition to the preferential tax treatment for foreign trade, a large number of merchants chose to use Icestone City as a transit point for their trade with the giant demon empire, causing the city to always be bustling with activity. Therefore, unlike the other territories in the northern frontier, Angeli's territory was already showing signs of prosperity this year. The citizens took the opportunity of this harvest festival to flood into Icestone City one after another, expressing their gratitude to the Lord who had brought them such a wonderful life. Although Count Angeli wasn't in the territory, this still didn't dampen the enthusiasm of the citizens. The taverns in the city had already prepared rich and cheap food and fine wine. Steward Eamon even specially invited more than 10 singing and dancing troupes and circuses to conduct a free public tour of Icestone City. The men lingered in the taverns drinking fine wine, the women flocked to the market to buy large amounts of goods, and the children chased after the circus's tracks, watching all kinds of novel and interesting performances. They couldn't stop screaming and laughing, clapping their little hands until they turned red, but they didn't feel any pain. However, the topic that the citizens of Icestone City talked about the most this year wasn't their increasingly wonderful lives, or how wonderful the performances of the troops were, or even Count Angeli who was far away in the half-elf kingdom. Instead, it was something called the welfare lottery. Did you hear? A lucky person appeared today. Is it the welfare lottery? Of course, other than this, what else could it be? Who's the lucky person? How much did he get? It's a guy called Tom. He won 5,000 copper coins. 5,000? Is that true? Of course it's true. I saw this kid go on stage to receive the prize with my own eyes. Are you talking about Tom? I know that kid. He's my distant cousin. I was the one who told him about the welfare lottery. When he was receiving the prize, I was still shouting for him from below the stage, but he didn't hear me. There were probably too many people present, and it was even noisier than the theater. Even if he heard it, he would pretend not to hear it. But because he's afraid that you'll borrow money from him. Why would I borrow money from him? If he can win the grand prize, why can't I? Today, I bought 5 lottery tickets and specially picked the lucky numbers. I'm sure I'll win the next lottery. The Earl of Avon led his fiancée, Shalia, into the tavern and found that the customers were all discussing the welfare lottery. During the harvest festival, business in the tavern was very good. The small space was divided into 2 floors. The lower floor was stuffed with more than 30 tables, and each table was full of people. There were also a circle of customers who couldn't find a seat. the crowded and noisy atmosphere made Shelia frown. Fortunately, the Earl of Avon quickly took her to the second floor. In contrast, the second floor was much more spacious, but this was also because the admission fee was much more expensive. The waiter of the tavern could tell at a glance that the Earl of Avon and Shelia's clothes were not ordinary. He knew that the two of them must be nobles, so he quickly and respectfully led them to a table by the window on the second floor. After the Earl of Avon sat down, he skillfully threw out a few copper coins and said, "Give us 2 cups of purple cane wine." "Okay, please wait a moment." After the waiter turned around, Shelia frowned and said, "Evan, why do you always like to come to places like this?" The Earl of Avon looked at the noisy crowd downstairs with interest and laughed. "Because I can drink good wine in these places." Shelia frowned even more and curled her lips. "Nonsense, what good wine can there be here?" "Huh, you don't understand. If we're talking about brewing techniques, the wine here can't compare to Noble's wineries, but the wine here has a special taste that Noble's wineries don't have." Please. "The taste of the secular world." "The secular world?" The Earl of Avon turned around and looked seriously into Shelia's big, bright eyes. He explained, "Noble's wineries are full of deliberate hypocrisy. Only here can you taste the real taste of the secular world." Shelia looked at the Earl of Avon's face and suddenly felt that she didn't understand her fiancé anymore. The Earl of Avon laughed and said with a smile, "I'm just joking with you. Actually, it's more likely to find traces of His Highness the Prince in a place like this." Shelia's face was full of disbelief as she shook her head. Even if Father came to Icestone City, he wouldn't enter a place like this. Also, if an outsider entered Icestone City, the first to know would definitely be the Lord's manor. No. If this outsider wanted to hide his identity, he would be on guard against the Lord's manor, but not these commoners. Shelia tilted her head in thought and found that it made sense, so she didn't say anything else. At this time, the attendant had already brought over 2 cups of purple cane wine. The Earl of Avon took the opportunity to ask, "May I ask if you've seen a middle-aged man? He's about 7 feet tall, has blonde hair, blue eyes, a cold face, and a purple scabbard knight's sword at his waist." After hearing the Earl of Avon's description, the attendant thought carefully and shook his head. "My apologies, my lord, I've never seen the person you're talking about." The Earl of Avon nodded, not too disappointed. After all, Prince Rhy's trail wasn't that easy to find. This time, they had only come to Icestone City with an attitude of giving it a try. He then asked, "What is the welfare lottery that the people below are talking about? Can you introduce it to us?" "Of course." The attendant's face instantly flushed red, as if he was very interested in the welfare lottery. "That's the welfare lottery. It's designed by our honorable lord, the great protector of the northern frontier, Count Angeli. It's said that it's to raise money to provide welfare to the poor commoners who can't take care of themselves. However, the Lord Count claims that all those who are willing to pay for the lottery are good people who are contributing to the cause of salvation. They deserve to be rewarded. Therefore, the lottery will be opened every month. As long as the number you buy is selected, you'll win the prize. One lottery ticket only costs 3 copper coins, but if you win, you can win thousands of copper coins as a reward. I've even heard that some people have 1 gold coins." Listening to the attendant's long-winded explanation, the Earl of Avon drank the purple cane wine and suddenly asked, "Then can an outsider like me buy it?" "Of course you can. The Lord Count said that this is a benefit for all the people of the northern frontier. Anyone from the northern frontier can buy it." "Then what if I'm not from the northern frontier?" "Well," the attendant touched the back of his head and muttered, "It shouldn't be a problem. When I went to buy a lottery ticket previously, I saw a bard who also bought a lottery ticket, and that guy said that he came here from the distant south." The Earl of Avon took out a silver coin and threw it to the attendant. He ordered, "Buy me 100 welfare lottery tickets, and the rest of the money will be your tip." "Okay, please wait for a moment." The attendant immediately took the silver coins and ran away like a wisp of smoke. A silver coin could be exchanged for 1,000 copper coins, and it would only cost 300 copper coins to buy 100 lottery tickets. The remaining 700 copper coins would belong to the attendant. He naturally wouldn't hesitate to make such a cheap deal. Shalia was puzzled. You're interested in these lottery tickets?
Yes.
It's a very interesting thing. The Earl of Avon drank the wine, and his eyes flashed with a strange light. Chapter 399. Not long after, the waiter placed a large stack of black papers in front of the Earl of Avon. The Earl of Avon smiled and nodded at the waiter. The waiter bowed and left. Is this the welfare lottery? Shalia took out a piece of black paper and looked at the white numbers on it. She asked curiously. The Earl of Avon also took out a piece and looked at it carefully. Then he took out a candle and lit it. The black paper produced an orange flame, and when it burned the white numbers, it produced an indigo flame. At the same time, a unique burnt smell quickly spread. The Earl of Avon threw away the almost burnt lottery ticket and said, "This is the same paper as the bonds, but the dye is different." So, when the bonds were released, I guessed that Earl Angeli had mastered a more advanced paper-making process. Now, it seems that it's true. This means that whether it's the lottery ticket or the bonds, they can't be forged. What is Earl Angeli planning to do by issuing this lottery ticket? What do you think he's planning? Shalia played with the welfare lottery ticket in her hand and said seriously, "I won't lie to you. To tell you the truth, looking at the welfare lottery tickets in front of me, I can't help but want to know if they have won or not. Although I also know that even if they have won, the reward is only a few thousand copper coins, I still can't help but think about it. It's as if they have a magical power. For a prince's daughter like me to have such a temptation, it shows how attractive these welfare lottery tickets are to the commoners." The Earl of Avon pointed at the drinkers who were still discussing the welfare lottery ticket downstairs and said with emotion, "Earl Angeli is so young, but he has such an accurate grasp of people's hearts. It's terrifying." Shalia stared at the Earl of Avon with her big sparkling eyes and said with a smile, "This is the first time I've heard you praise someone so highly." The Earl of Avon shrugged and said with a bitter smile, "As a peer, Earl Angeli's power is far beyond mine. How can I not be convinced? What's more, he comes from an inconspicuous baron family, but I'm a descendant of the paladin family. Sometimes I even feel that I'm not worthy of the paladin bloodline." Shalia pursed her seductive red lips and said, "Earl Angeli is not that powerful. The reason why he has his current status is because of the House of St. Hilda. If he didn't marry Vera St. Hilda, how could he have been so successful?" The Earl of Avon shook his head seriously and said, "No, it's not because of the House of St. Hilda. It's the House of St. Hilda that relies on him." Seeing his fiancée's disapproving face, the Earl of Avon sighed and said, "If you seriously study the past two rebellions in the northern frontier, you will understand that without Earl Angeli, the current lord of the northern frontier would have changed his surname to St. Theon." Shalia seemed to be a little unconvinced and said, "Even so, Earl Angeli spent his intelligence and wisdom on the inferior people and issued these welfare lottery tickets just to earn some money. It's really unbecoming of a noble." No, this is not a small amount of money." The Earl of Avon shook his head again and again. "I don't know the specific probability of winning the lottery ticket. Even if it's 1 in 1,000, many of the prizes are small prizes of 10 copper coins or 100 copper coins. The probability of winning the big prize is estimated to be 1 in 10,000 at most. If we calculate it this way, compared to the income from selling the lottery tickets, those prizes are not even worth mentioning. Look at the sales of the lottery tickets in Icestone City right now. I assume that each of the 300,000 citizens here only buys one lottery ticket every month. That's close to 900,000 copper coins. That's not a lot, it's only 900 gold coins. If I remember correctly, the royal family's annual tax income is more than 9 million gold coins." The Earl of Avon rolled his eyes and secretly sighed that his fiancée was of noble birth and didn't know the hardships of the world. She actually used the royal family's tax income as a comparison. Thus, he could only patiently explain, "Don't forget, this 900 gold coins is only for a month, and it's only for Icestone City. If the lottery tickets slowly spread throughout the northern frontier and affect tens of millions of people, do you still think this income is a small amount?" Shalia was instantly speechless. After a while, she suddenly realized something and said, "Evan, tell me, Isn't this a different kind of tax? Smart. The Earl of Avon snapped his fingers and praised, "If you can think of this, then you finally understand a part of Count Angeli's ingenious plan." A part? Does the lottery ticket have other uses? Of course. If you think that Count Angeli only wants to use this lottery ticket to amass wealth, then you're looking down on this genius. Then what other plans does Count Angeli have? Shalia's beautiful eyes moved as she asked seriously. The Earl of Avon raised his wine cup and took a sip, leisurely saying, "Think about it, what is the original intention of this lottery ticket?" Shalia thought back to the tavern waiter's explanation and said somewhat uncertainly, "Is it really to help the poor? Isn't this a dignified excuse that Count Angeli came up with?" Haha, Shalia, you're underestimating Count Angeli's magnanimity and scheme. Does he really plan to use the lottery ticket income to help the poor? The Earl of Avon nodded affirmatively, then shook his head. But he's not doing this out of kindness, at least not completely. Then what is it for? The Earl of Avon's eyes flashed and asked rhetorically, "Think about it again. Which organization is responsible for helping the poor in the Empire of Light?" "It's the church." "Then why are they doing this?" Shalia was a little dazed. "Isn't it the church's duty to help the poor?" The Earl of Avon laughed and asked again, "So the church really doesn't ask for anything in return for helping the poor? What are you trying to say?" The Earl of Avon lowered his voice and said, "The poor are more devout than the rich, the old are more devout than the young, the sick are more devout than the healthy. Shalia, these poor people at the bottom of society are actually the church's most firm supporters." Shalia's beautiful brows furrowed again. She seemed to understand the Earl of Avon's meaning a little. The Earl of Avon drank the wine in his cup and said leisurely, "Salvation is a kind of responsibility, but it's also a kind of authority. And Count Angeli wants to steal the church's authority." Shalia was shocked, her beautiful eyes widening as she looked at her fiancé in disbelief. The Earl of Avon slowly put down the wine cup and said with a smile, "All right, the commoner's wine is finished, we should go and try the noble's wine." Shalia still hadn't recovered from her shock and said after a while, "You mean the Red Castle?" "Coming to Icestone City, it would be rude if we didn't pay a visit to the owner." The Earl of Avon had a matter-of-fact expression. Shalia blinked her beautiful big eyes and said hesitantly, "But Count Angeli isn't in the Red Castle right now." "Isn't that even better?" The Earl of Avon smiled faintly and threw a few copper coins on the table as a tip. Then he stood up and walked out. Shalia was stunned for a moment before she hurriedly followed him. Chapter 400. Red Castle, Guest Hall. The Earl of Avon observed the decorations in the hall as he smiled and said, "It's fine. I know that Count Angeli isn't at the northern frontier. Miss Shalia and I didn't come here to visit Count Angeli. I'm sure you've heard some news. We've been looking for Prince Ari." Eamon had a polite smile on his face as he said, "I'm sorry, Your Excellency Earl of Avon, Miss Shalia. As far as I know, Prince Rhy hasn't appeared in Icestone City." The Earl of Avon seemed a little disappointed as he said regretfully, "All right, thank you very much for the information. I wonder if we can stay in the Red Castle for a while and rest up." "Of course. You and Miss Shalia are both honored guests of the Angeli family and should be treated with the warmest hospitality. Also, if there's news of Prince Rhy, I'll definitely inform the two of you." "Thank you very much." The Earl of Avon and Shalia stood up to thank him, then they were led to the guest room by the maid. After a simple tidying up, the Earl of Avon left the room. When he knocked on Shalia's door, he was told by the maid that she was bathing. Thus, the Earl of Avon wandered around the castle alone. This Red Castle was inherited from the Sue Duo family. At the beginning, because the Angeli family was financially strapped, Colin only painted the castle's outer walls with a layer of red paint and didn't touch the things inside. However, as Colin's power and status rose rapidly, this castle that was originally built for viscounts seemed a little cramped and didn't match up to Colin's status. Thus, recently, with Colin's approval, Eamon began to upgrade the castle in all aspects. Along the way, the Earl of Avon could see a large number of troll slaves working hard. What surprised him was that these troll slaves were very motivated. Even if the supervisors around them didn't wave their whips to urge them, they didn't slack off at all. This was very different from the image of slaves in the Earl of Avon's mind. Curious, the Earl of Avon went forward to talk to the supervisors. The supervisors didn't know the identity of the Earl of Avon, but they still recognized the Earl of Avon's formal attire because it was the same style of formal attire in the Empire. Their own lord, Count Angeli, wore this formal attire. Therefore, the supervisors didn't dare to hide anything from Count Elvin's inquiry. Were points? Count Elvin nodded inwardly as he savored the new system created by Colin. He realized that this was indeed an excellent method to motivate the slaves. Then if a troll slave obtains enough work points and regains his commoner status, can he immediately leave Icestone City and return to the Troll Empire? Yes, Lord Count. Not only that, the merciful Lord also promised that if the troll slaves don't want to travel thousands of miles back to the Troll Empire, they can still stay in Icestone City. The Earl of Avon immediately furrowed his brows. He suddenly realized that after entering Icestone City, he had indeed noticed that there were a lot of trolls in the city. At the time, he didn't pay much attention to it. He thought that most of these trolls were probably merchants who came to the northern frontier, but he didn't expect that many of them were troll slaves who had their identities restored. If they stay in Icestone City, won't these trolls be afraid of being bullied by humans? Of course not. Lord of Avon His Highness specially issued a decree stating that trolls and humans have the same rights and duties in Angeli's territory. They can't be discriminated against or bullied by anyone. You don't have any objections to this? Of course not, the supervisor said without hesitation. This is Lord of Avon's order. Moreover, these troll slaves have already atoned for their sins through hard work. I don't think there's a need to continue punishing them. Of course, if they don't behave here, then the city guards won't be polite to them. The Earl of Avon sized up the troll slaves who were sweating profusely and asked, then approximately how many troll slaves have already settled down in Icestone City through this method? There are probably over 100 of them. That many? The Earl of Avon was a bit surprised. Those trolls who have their freedom restored are all willing to stay? In the beginning, there weren't many trolls who were willing to stay, but after they discovered that the citizens of Icestone City didn't bully the trolls who stayed, more and more trolls were willing to stay. After all, compared to the harsh conditions of the sky ice plains, the climate here is comfortable and life is rich. As long as the trolls aren't stupid, they know what to choose. Also, I know that after some of the trolls on the ice plains learned about this, they came to Icestone City in droves, attempting to become Lord Count Angeli's subjects. However, as for these trolls who were smuggled in, the Lord Count captured them and put them into the slave army. He also promised that if they could earn enough work points through their hard work, then he would allow them to settle down in Icestone City. Not only did this not frighten the trolls who were smuggled in, but it also attracted even more trolls to Icestone City. This caused the troll slave army in the city to grow larger and larger. Perhaps in the near future, we will see even more trolls settling down in the city. Hearing the supervisor's explanation, the Earl of Avon was even more surprised. He suddenly realized that Colin was pushing for the trolls to integrate into Icestone City. The benefits of this were obvious. Icestone City would be able to obtain a large amount of free labor in a short period of time, greatly promoting the development of Angeli's territory. However, the downside was the differences and conflicts between races couldn't be eliminated with a simple lord's order. Right now, there weren't many trolls in the city, so the conflicts hadn't become obvious. However, as more and more trolls regained their freedom and settled down in the city, would they really be able to live in peace with humans? If war broke out between the northern frontier and the Troll Empire in the future, what would happen to the trolls in Icestone City? To be honest, the Earl of Avon felt that Colin's actions were a bit too rash. If a large number of trolls appeared in Icestone City, perhaps even the royal family and the church would have objections. However, the Earl of Avon didn't dare to come to a conclusion. This was because Colin had already made too many decisions that seemed unreasonable but were actually quite successful. Regarding the trolls, the Earl of Avon really wanted to know what Colin's complete plan was. While he was deep in thought, the Earl of Avon suddenly felt the surroundings suddenly become quiet. He raised his head in confusion and saw that the supervisors were all looking behind him. Turning around, the Earl of Avon saw his fiancée standing there. Shelia had changed into a long gown with golden embroidery. She wore a pair of exquisitely crafted bright gold high heels. Her waist swayed gently, and her steps were light and graceful. The girdle of the gown outlined the beautiful curves of a young girl. Her pure green eyes were deep and ethereal. It was no wonder that the supervisors were dumbfounded by the appearance of such a beautiful and elegant noble girl. Seeing the Earl of Avon turn around, Shelia smiled sweetly and said, "Evan, what are you doing here?" "Nothing, just strolling around." "Then let's go to the dining hall. Steward Eamon just sent someone to inform me that the banquet is ready." "All right." Chapter 401. Hundreds of candles illuminated the dining hall of the Red Castle as bright as day. When the Earl of Avon and Shelia walked in, the butler Eamon immediately greeted them and led them to the long table in the center of the dining hall. Although the Earl of Avon's status was the most honorable, he was still a guest and could only sit on the left side of the main seat. Shelia sat next to the Earl of Avon. On the main seat, there was a thin, hale, and hearty old man. The Earl of Avon knew that this man was called Huisius Angelo, and he was the uncle of Count Angelo. At this time, Count Angelo was not in the Red Castle. Although the real person in charge here was the butler Eamon, after all, his surname was not Angelo, so he could not sit on the main seat. Therefore, Huisius, who had the highest seniority, became the nominal master. But Huisius obviously had not experienced such a big scene before. Facing an earl of the eastern region and the daughter of a paladin prince, his words were a bit shaky. This was the result of the family's lack of background. Except for Colin, there was no one in the Angeli family who could hold the fort. The Earl of Avon did not seem to care about this. He had a warm smile on his face and skillfully used all kinds of communication skills to maintain the enthusiasm of the scene. At the same time, he did not seem to overshadow the host. Gradually, Huisius also found that the honorable guest did not seem to be difficult to get along with, so he also relaxed. Earl, when Colin was in the Kingdom of Grey Castle, his martial arts teacher was Baron Raymond. In addition, the Knight of Rigo often taught Colin. "I see." The Earl of Avon thoughtfully nodded and then turned his eyes to the burly man opposite him who was eating the meat of a water lizard. "You are the Knight of Rigo, right?" Rigo reluctantly put down the meat in his hand, bowed his head, and then said in a low voice, "Yes, Earl. When Count Angelo was learning martial arts from you, he must have shown great talent very early on, right?" "Of course." Without even thinking, Leg began to brag for Colin at the top of his voice. "The Count's talent in martial arts is extremely high. He finished learning all the skills I know in a few days. Now, I don't even dare to spar with the Count." The Earl of Avon smiled and questioned, "But I heard that Angeli was stuck as an apprentice for 3 years. Hearing this, Steward Eamon looked up and gave Count Elvin a deep look. Shelia also frowned slightly, as if she felt that her fiancé was being a little rude. Leg didn't mind. He rubbed his big bald head, laughed, and answered mysteriously, "Actually, the Count has been hiding his strength all this time. His martial skills are not below mine." "I see." The Earl of Avon looked seriously at the Knight of Rigo and found that the other party was smiling at him honestly, as if he was not hiding anything. The Earl of Avon didn't ask further. Instead, he turned to Huisius and said, "Mr. Huisius, I have always had a question, but I don't know if I should ask." Huisius' old face suddenly smiled like a chrysanthemum, and he said respectfully, "Earl, please ask. As long as I know, I will tell you the truth." The Earl of Avon took a sip of the red wine in his glass and then asked, "In the history of the Angeli family, what was the rank of the strongest knight that appeared?" Huisius hesitated for a moment. It was unknown whether he couldn't remember clearly or was unwilling to answer. His eyes drifted to Eamon. Eamon coughed and said, "Earl, the strongest knight recorded in the history of the Angeli family was the 4th rank. However, the bloodline of the Angeli family can be traced back to before the founding of the Radiant Empire. The historical records of that period have been lost. Therefore, No one knows what kind of powerful knights were born in the Angeli family before that. I see. The Earl of Avon seemed to believe Aemon's words. But just as he was about to ask more questions, Aemon beat him to it and spoke first. Lord Earl, I just received news from the half-elf kingdom. Would you like to hear it? The Earl of Avon smiled and invited, of course, please go ahead. A smile also appeared on Aemon's old-fashioned face, and he said, Queen Aisha successfully gave birth to a baby girl. This is a joyous occasion. Count Elvin immediately raised his wine cup and said with a sincere smile. Everyone also raised their glasses to celebrate this good news. Putting down his glass, Aemon immediately continued, however, during the period when Queen Aisha was giving birth, a rebellion broke out in Silver Moon City. Fortunately, it has been suppressed by the Old Master's army. With Earl Angeli, there is naturally no need to worry about a rebellion. The Earl of Avon said with a smile. It seemed like he had great confidence in Colin. Aemon looked deeply at the Earl of Avon and said, the mastermind of the rebellion has also been arrested. Earl, do you know who this mastermind is? The smile on the Earl of Avon's face disappeared and he sighed, if I'm not wrong, it should be my brother, Mar Vincent? Aemon nodded expressionlessly and didn't say anything else. For a moment, the scene was silent and the atmosphere gradually became awkward. The Earl of Avon raised his glass and stood up. He said with a sincere attitude, everyone, I can assure you that I know nothing about the rebellion in Silver Moon City. But please believe that Vincent alone cannot represent the House of St. Prospero, nor can he represent the attitude of the Eastern region. I have good intentions towards the Angeli family, towards the northern frontier, and towards the half-elven kingdom. Since this regrettable matter has already happened, I can only express my sincerest apologies. After saying that, the Earl of Avon drank the wine in his glass in one gulp. He then placed his hand on his chest and bowed deeply to everyone present. The current solemn atmosphere made Huizius somewhat at a loss. He opened his mouth, as if wanting to say something to ease the atmosphere, but under the deep gaze of Aemon, he immediately shut his mouth. After expressing his apology, the Earl of Avon turned his gaze to Aemon. Seeing that the other party didn't respond for a long time, he sighed again and said, if that's the case, then this unwelcome guest won't disturb you any further. After saying that, he strode out in large strides. Shelia also smiled apologetically. She stood up and was about to chase after him. At this moment, Aemon finally spoke. Miss Shelia, this matter has nothing to do with you. You are still a welcome guest in the Red Castle. I understand. Shelia nodded, but still chased after him. After exiting the door, Shelia saw the Earl of Avon waiting for her outside. I'm not welcome here. I'm afraid we have to leave. The Earl of Avon said somewhat helplessly. Shelia shook her head and said, no, this place just doesn't welcome you. If you want to return to the Eastern region, I won't go with you. The Earl of Avon frowned and said, Shelia, since your father entrusted you to me, then I won't leave you alone. No, I don't need to be entrusted to anyone. Shelia's tone was firm. Moreover, from the beginning, your goal was Count Angeli. Helping me find my father was just something you did along the way, the Earl of Avon hurriedly explained. Shelia, you misunderstood me. But Shelia immediately interrupted, Evan, if you continue to argue, it will only make me look down on you. I know that in your heart, the Eastern region will always be the first, and I will at most be the second. I'm not blaming you, and I'm not forcing you to put me before the Eastern region. Now that your brother is in trouble in Silver Moon City, I know that your heart is no longer here. Since that's the case, then you should go do what you want to do. Looking for my father, I can do it alone. The Earl of Avon saw the alienation and indifference in his fiancée's eyes that he had never seen before. He couldn't help but start to panic and hurriedly said, Shelia, listen to me. But Shelia immediately turned around, only leaving the Earl of Avon with a firm back and an indifferent sentence. Sorry, Evan, I have to go back. The banquet isn't over yet. Chapter 402. Silver Moon City, Half-Elven Palace. Colin sat on the throne as if there was no one around him. His left index finger, which wore a crystal ring, was gently tapping on the purple gold armrest. His gaze was leisurely looking at the Eastern Region emissary who was bowing to him at the bottom of the steps. Honorable Guardian of the Northern Frontier, Count Angeli, on behalf of the Duke of St. Prospero, the Lord of the Eastern Region, I would like to express my sincerest apologies for what Marquis Vincent has done. I hope that you can forgive Marquis Vincent's mistake on account of the thousands of years of friendship between the Eastern Region and the Northern Frontier. The Eastern Region emissary was a young man with a fair complexion. His short beard had obviously been carefully groomed. There was a faint sense of reservation and arrogance between his eyebrows. The noble attire on his body showed that he was a Viscount's. Viscount's Finn, did you just come from Alfalfa City? Colin asked with a smile. Yes. The smile on Colin's face became even more brilliant. Marquis Vincent had previously told him that this Viscount's Finn, who was in charge of the overall situation in Alfalfa City, was actually a supporter of the Earl of Avon, the second son of the Duke of St. Prospero. Then this was a bit interesting. The Duke of St. Prospero had actually sent his second son's supporter to Silvermoon City to negotiate with Colin about the redemption of his eldest son, Marquis Vincent. Was the Duke of St. Prospero worried that the emissary would be blackmailed by Colin, so he sent his second son's supporter, or did he not want his eldest son anymore, so he deliberately gave his second son a chance to destroy the redemption negotiations? Colin stopped tapping his fingers and asked again, I heard that a large-scale armed fight broke out in Alfalfa City. How is the situation there now? Viscount's Finn respectfully replied, Lord Count, you can rest assured that Alfalfa City has now regained its stability. Knight Ron is an outstanding city lord and has completely controlled the situation in Alfalfa City. Of course, Colin knew that the other party was talking nonsense. He was very clear about how sullen Ron was as the city lord. Alfalfa City would never be under Ron's control. Right now, the true master of Alfalfa City was actually the former leader of the thieves, Orlando. To be honest, although Colin had secretly given Orlando a lot of help and even gave him real bonds as a bargaining chip, he was still a little surprised that Orlando had actually passed the test of the Eastern Region as he wished and became the president of the Alfalfa City Brotherhood. It must be known that the Eastern Region had previously placed a rank 5 warrior in Alfalfa City, but in reality he was a rank 6 warrior, Capone. It could be seen that the Eastern Region attached great importance to Alfalfa City. But now, they actually sent the leader of the thieves, Orlando, to the position of the Alfalfa Brotherhood's president. Even though Orlando had indeed made a great contribution during the chaos in Alfalfa City, this still surprised Colin. Of course, this was definitely a pleasant surprise for Colin. He just couldn't help but be a little curious about how Orlando gained the trust of the Eastern Region. Or could it be that this Viscount's Fines was too gullible? Viscount's Fines saw that Colin did not speak for a moment, so he raised his head slightly. Then he saw a meaningful smile on Colin's face. Before he could figure out the meaning behind this smile, he heard Colin speak again. Viscount's Fines, the Duke of St. Prospero should have received the handwritten letter that Marquis Vincent sent back to the Eastern Region, right? Then what does Your Grace think of the redemption conditions proposed in the letter? Your Grace thinks that the redemption conditions you proposed are insincere. Viscount's Fines' somewhat rude bluntness stunned Colin slightly, but he was not angry. He just smiled faintly and said, What? In order to redeem a son, the Duke of St. Prospero is reluctant to part with a few ships? Your Grace, you want more than a few ships, Viscount's Fines replied bluntly. That's all the essence of the Pegasus Navy. If we really give it all to you, then wouldn't the new Shui River become the bathtub of the Army of the North? Colin smiled slightly and changed his sitting position on the throne. He asked patiently, Then what is the Eastern Region going to exchange for Marquis Vincent? Viscount's Fines did not answer this question. Instead, he raised his head and looked directly into Colin's eyes. He said seriously, Your Grace, before discussing the redemption conditions, shouldn't you let me see Marquis Vincent? The smile on Colin's face immediately disappeared. He frowned and said, Don't worry, Marquis Vincent and I are old friends. It's not the first time he's been my prisoner. Although I'm very angry at what he did, I won't abuse him. Viscount Fines insisted, "I'm sorry, Your Grace. It's not that I don't believe you. It's just that the Duke of St. Prospero is worried about his eldest son. He asked me to see Marquis Vincent with my own eyes first to confirm that he's safe and sound. Then, we'll talk about the redemption conditions." Colin looked at the determined Viscount Fines and suddenly asked meaningfully, "Viscount Fines, did you hear some unfounded rumors?" Viscount Fines smiled faintly and said, "Your Grace, I did hear some rumors, but please rest assured that I'm not the kind of person who can be moved by some unfounded rumors. I only believe in my own eyes." Colin stared into the eyes of Viscount Fines, and Viscount Fines also looked back at him without flinching. After a long while, Colin smiled and said, "Since you want to see Marquis Vincent so much, then all right." As he said that, Colin clapped his hands and ordered the guard in the hall, "Go and invite Marquis Vincent here." The guard immediately accepted the order and left. Seeing this, Viscount Fines' eyes flashed with an imperceptible doubt, but it quickly disappeared. Colin leaned against the back of his chair and did not say anything else. He just continued to tap the armrest of the throne with his left index finger. The tapping sounds reverberated in the spacious palace. Every tap seemed to be tapping on one's heart. Viscount Fines lowered his head and recalled the information he had received from a half-elf merchant before he came. His original confidence began to slowly diminish. After a short but extremely long wait, the guard finally returned. However, when he returned, he was still alone. "Your Grace, Marquis Vincent said that he does not want to see the emissary of the Eastern region." "I see." Colin stopped tapping, spread out his hands, and said regretfully, "Viscount Fines, there's nothing I can do about that." Viscount Fines lowered his head and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly, as if he had finally seen through Colin's background. His confidence that had just dissipated was restored again. He raised his head, and his face had already changed into a puzzled and aggrieved expression. He asked the guard, "Did the Marquis say why he doesn't want to see me?" The guard glanced at Colin, then shook his head and said, "No. Perhaps Marquis Vincent is still ashamed of what he has done, so he doesn't want to see you," Colin explained. Viscount Fines nodded as if he believed this reason, but he still insisted, "But Your Grace, I must see Marquis Vincent. This is what the Duke of St. Prospero personally told me. Why don't we discuss the ransom conditions first before arranging for you to meet?" Colin waved his hand to interrupt Viscount Fines and said in a rather domineering tone, "If we can't even discuss the ransom conditions, then I don't think there's a need for you to see Marquis Vincent again." Viscount Fines' expression changed slightly, as if he was intimidated by Colin's aura. After hesitating for a moment, he finally nodded and said, "All right, Your Grace, then let's talk about the ransom conditions first." Chapter 403. Your Excellency, the Duke of St. Prospero will never agree to the warships you requested. Then what is the Duke of St. Prospero willing to give to redeem his son? The Viscount took out a scroll from his bosom, took a few steps forward, and slowly unfolded it in front of Colin. It was a map. Colin leaned forward slightly and focused his gaze on the map. He wasn't worried that the Viscount would play a trick. After all, the Viscount's strength wasn't as good as his. Even if the Viscount had the ability to stab a dagger into Colin's chest, well, he wouldn't be able to kill a vampire. "Your Excellency, please take a look. This city on the east bank of the New Shui River is called Monolith City. It covers an area of about 150 square miles. There are 180,000 people living in it. The annual tax income is more than 200,000 gold coins. It can be considered a quite prosperous city. The Duke of St. Prospero promises that if you are willing to release Marquis Vincent, then this Monolith City will be under your rule." Colin looked expressionlessly at the point circled by the Viscounts on the map and couldn't help but sneer in his heart. A city for a person. It seemed like a good deal. But to Colin, it didn't mean anything. Although Monolith City was good, it was an enclave. As long as the New Shui River was still in the hands of the Eastern region, Colin couldn't transport a large number of troops to guard Monolith City. Without a large number of troops to guard it, how could he maintain law and order? How could he manage it? How could he collect taxes? At that time, the city would only belong to Colin in name, but in reality, it would still be under the control of the Eastern region. It was equivalent to the Eastern region not paying anything in exchange for Marquis Vincent. Wishful thinking. Therefore, Colin curled his lips impatiently and said, "I don't want your Eastern region city. Let's talk about the warships." The Viscount shook his head firmly and said, "I'm sorry, Your Excellency. The Duke of St. Prospero won't exchange the warships with you." Then he's using the Eastern region city to fool me? Colin was no longer polite. The other party was simply deliberately playing him for a fool. "Your Excellency, if you're not satisfied with Monolith City, we can change to a bigger city." "No need. Even if you give me the White Dew City, I won't exchange it." Colin suddenly stood up from the throne and strode down the stairs. He walked down the stairs and stared into the Viscount's eyes coldly, from a close distance, and said in a deep voice, "It seems like Duke St. Pros doesn't want to exchange his son. Since that's the case, there's no need for us to waste our breath. Let Marquis Vincent follow me back to the north as a guest." Seeing Colin's firm attitude, the Viscounts could no longer maintain his previous calmness and restraint. He hurriedly urged him to stay. "Your Excellency, we can always discuss the conditions of redemption. Why are you in such a hurry?" Colin smiled coldly and said, "I just don't want to waste time with people who aren't sincere. Go back and tell the Duke of St. Prospero that other than the warships, don't even think about exchanging his son with any other nonsense." Seeing the Viscount's troubled expression, Colin spoke again with a slightly gentler tone. "Of course, we can slowly discuss the number and tonnage of the warships." Seeing this, the Viscounts could only nod and say, "Yes, Your Excellency. I will definitely convey your intentions to the Duke of St. Prospero." After saying that, he bowed and left. After leaving the palace, the Viscounts got into a gorgeous carriage. The carriage went all the way south out of Silvermoon City and stopped in front of an inconspicuous villa on the outskirts of the city. The Viscounts got out of the carriage and was welcomed into the villa by a butler. Seeing the Viscounts walk into the hall, Javier hurriedly stood up from behind the table with a fawning expression. He bowed and said, "Your Excellency, the conditions here are simple and crude. I hope you don't mind." The Viscounts waved his hand casually, indicating that he did not mind. At the same time, he came to the table and sat down. Javier, the legendary half-elf merchant, was like a hard-working servant at this moment, eagerly pouring tea for the Viscounts. The Viscounts enjoyed all of this as if it was a matter of course. He asked, "Javier, is your information really accurate? Why does Colin Angelo seem to be very confident?" Javier stood at the side with his hands folded and replied respectfully, "Your Excellency, of course I won't lie to you. As for the accuracy of the information, please allow me to ask, you didn't see Marquis Vincent in the palace just now, right?" "Indeed I didn't." "That's right." Javier clapped his hands and said, "If Marquis Vincent is really safe and sound, why wouldn't Colin Angelo agree to let you see him? As for the attitude of this Count of the Northern Frontier, it must be deliberately pretending. If he shows any weakness at this time, wouldn't you see through the truth?" The Viscount smiled noncommittally and said, "Then what's the point of him doing this? Even if we have negotiated the terms of redemption, if we don't see Marquis Vincent safe and sound, it's impossible for us to give anything to Colin Angelo." Javier thought for a moment and said thoughtfully, "Maybe he wants to stall for time. After all, if the Duke of St. Prospero knows that his eldest son died in the half-elven palace, I'm afraid that the warships of the Pegasus Navy would have already sailed along the Crystal River to Silvermoon City. And Silvermoon City has just experienced a great chaos. The Silvermoon Guard has suffered heavy casualties. Even the Blood Cavalry of the Northern Frontier has suffered heavy losses. Colin Angelo definitely doesn't want to face the army of the Eastern Frontier at this time. That's why he blocked the news and deliberately showed his toughness in front of you. He put forward extremely harsh redemption terms to stall for time as much as possible. I'm guessing that the army of the Northern Frontier has already begun to mobilize and is ready to reinforce Silvermoon City at any time. When the army of the Northern Frontier arrives at Silvermoon City, Colin Angelo will probably no longer block the news of Marquis Vincent's death. Viscount Finn's expression changed when he heard this and he fell into deep thought. When Javier saw this, he lowered his voice and advised again, "Lord Viscounts, now is a golden opportunity. If you miss it, are you telling me what to do?" Viscount Finn glanced at Javier coldly. Javier's heart tightened and he waved his hand repeatedly. "Lord, I definitely didn't mean that." "Definitely not." Viscount Finn snorted coldly and said, "Javier, war is a big matter. It's not something a small merchant like you can discuss. Be careful with your words in the future. Otherwise..." Javier cried and kept apologizing. At the same time, he explained, "Lord Viscounts, I was too anxious and said the wrong thing. That Colin Angelo wants to bring the entire half-elven business into his control and make us all his puppets. We can't bear such humiliation. That's why I said the wrong thing. Please forgive me." Viscount Finn waved his hand and said, "All right, be careful with your words in the future. As for how the eastern frontier will decide on this matter, it's not something you can talk about. Now, there's only one thing you need to do." Javier's spirit was lifted and he quickly asked, "Viscounts, please instruct me." Viscount Finn's eyes flashed and he said in a deep voice, "At all costs, find out whether Marquis Vincent is dead or alive." "Yes, Lord." Chapter 404. It was late at night. Most of the streets in Silvermoon City were very quiet, and there were only passers-by hurriedly passing by. Especially near the half-elven palace, there were fully armed patrols of the blood cavalry everywhere. The rebellion had been over for almost a month, but the atmosphere here was still tense and dignified. Suddenly, the south gate of the palace opened slowly, and then a thin half-elf walked out quickly. He looked to be in his 60s or 70s, with gray hair and a solemn face. He was striding towards the south city under the cold moonlight. On his left and right, there were 2 armored guards accompanying him. As a doctor in the palace, Cliff was generally not allowed to leave the palace. This time, it was because his grandson outside the palace suddenly fell seriously ill. Cliff pleaded with many people, and even Queen Aisha was alarmed, so he was allowed to leave. But because of his special profession, even if he left the palace, he couldn't walk around freely. He had to be accompanied by special guards, who were both for protection and monitoring. Cliff was worried about his grandson's illness, so he walked in a hurry without stopping. But just as he passed by a tavern, the wooden door suddenly opened without any warning. A drunkard staggered out, his mouth shouting nonsense, and was about to bump into Cliff, who was passing by. "Get out of the way, get out of the way." The accompanying guards hurried forward, trying to block the drunkard. But when he just touched the drunkard's body, a sharp pain suddenly came from his lower abdomen. "Assassin!" The guard immediately realized that something was wrong, and shouted at the top of his voice. The other guard didn't go to rescue his companion, but immediately pulled Cliff's arm and ran away. At the same time, he began to shout loudly, trying to attract the patrolling blood cavalry. However, at this moment, a black carriage without a badge just passed by. The horse that pulled the carriage seemed to be frightened by the shout of the guard, and suddenly went crazy. Under the great force, the carriage swayed as if it was drunk. Bang! Amidst this shaking, a black wooden chest fell from the carriage and heavily smashed onto the ground. Crack! The wooden box was like a watermelon that fell to the ground, and countless small sawdust and small things that were shining with metal splashed everywhere. Ding ding dang dang. It was only then that the people present realized that the little things that were shining with a metallic light were all copper coins. Time seemed to have been paused. Even the guards who were escorting Cliff were stunned. After a brief moment of silence, there was an explosion of noise. No one knew who shouted, but in an instant, all the drinkers in the tavern rushed out and pounced on the copper coins scattered all over the floor like hungry wolves. Moreover, as time passed, more and more people came to snatch the money. It was as if the entire street was alarmed. Among the crowd, Cliff was like a small boat drifting with the waves. He finally squeezed out of the crowd. Just as he heaved a sigh of relief, he turned around and saw that the person who pulled his arm wasn't one of the accompanying guards. "Who are you? If you dare to make a sound, you're dead." Clive only felt that the stranger in black's hand was like an iron clamp that was choking him, and he was unable to break free at all. Furthermore, he was also acutely aware that a sharp blade was pointed at his back. At this time, the blood cavalry who was patrolling nearby also rushed over. After seeing the chaos in front of them, they immediately took out their weapons and began to maintain order. Cliff was anxious and was thinking about how to let the blood cavalry notice him. But at this time, the man in black behind him reminded him with a cold tone, "Don't do stupid things. Otherwise, not only you, but also your family will die." Cliff hesitated for a moment, but he still didn't dare to ask for help from the blood cavalry in front of him. And the blood cavalry didn't notice Cliff in the shadow. Their attention was all attracted by the chaos in front of the tavern. When they finally dispersed the crowd and found the bodies of the two escorting guards, Cliff had already disappeared. In an abandoned warehouse in the south of the city, the man in black pushed Cliff in rudely. The old and weak Cliff staggered and rolled on the cold ground. When he stood up in shock, he saw that there were 7 or 8 strangers in black around him. "Who are you? Why do you kidnap me? I'm a doctor in the palace. If Her Majesty knows about this, she will never let you go." Cliff roared in a threatening manner. But such a threat was obviously not taken seriously by the men in black. They didn't speak, but just looked at Cliff coldly, as if they were looking at a corpse. The leader of the men in black took off his hat and threw it aside. Then he moved a shabby chair and sat in front of Cliff casually. He smiled slightly and said, "Mr. Cliff, we just want to ask you a question this time." "What's the question?" Cliff had realized that something was wrong. The eyes of the man in black were like a poisonous snake, drilling into his heart. "After Marquis Vincent in the eastern region was assassinated, did you go to check the situation?" "Sure enough." Cliff's face suddenly changed and became as pale as a dead fish. "You deceived me to go out of the palace, right? My grandson is not sick at all, right?" The leader of the men in black smiled and took out a knife from the upper pocket of his clothes. He played with it casually in his hand and said slowly, "Mr. Cliff, have you forgotten about your situation? Here, it's not your turn to ask questions. We will ask, you will answer." Cliff's face turned green and white. His eyes were also erratic. One moment he was scared, the next he was excited. Finally, his face turned gray and he said in a pleading tone, "Everyone, it's not that I don't want to answer your questions, but once I answer, I will definitely die." The man in black calmly said, "Don't worry, as long as you cooperate, we will definitely protect you to leave Silver Moon City safely. Also, we will give you a large sum of money and let you go to the eastern region to live comfortably for the rest of your life." "You are from the eastern region?" The fear on Cliff's face became more intense. The man in black rolled his eyes and seemed to be speechless at Cliff's lack of awareness. He urged, "All right, Mr. Cliff, quickly answer my question." Cliff knelt down with a thud and complained tearfully, "Sir, I really can't answer. You tried every possible way to deceive me out of the palace and kidnapped me. Queen Aisha and Count Angeli must have already heard the news. At this time, the gate of Silver Moon City will definitely be sealed. We can't escape." The man in black sighed and said, "It seems that Mr. Cliff is still not willing to cooperate. Since that's the case, then I'm sorry." After saying that, the man in black stood up. Following his movements, the 2 men in black beside him immediately strode forward and firmly restrained Cliff from both sides. "What are you doing? You want to—" Cliff was extremely frightened and struggled. Unfortunately, he could not break free from the man in black's restraint. At the same time, a piece of rag was stuffed in his mouth. This time, he could only make woo-woot sounds. The leader of the black-clothed men slowly walked in front of Cliff. He gently pulled out Cliff's ring finger and stroked it gently. But in the next second, a silver light flashed and the ring finger was chopped off from Cliff's hand. Chapter 405. Woo woo woo. His fingers were connected to his heart. Under the intense pain, Cliff was like a fish that was about to suffocate as his body kept shaking. Blood splattered all over the surrounding men in black, but they didn't move at all. They didn't even bother to wipe off the blood that fell on their faces, as if they were already used to such a scene. When Cliff had slightly recovered his breath, the leader of the men in black tore off the rag in his mouth and asked again, Mr. Cliff, are you willing to cooperate now? Cliff looked at his broken wound. Blood was gushing out like a spring, and soon, it formed a small pool on the ground. He said weakly, I beg you, just kill me with one slash. The man in black picked up the ring finger that fell on the ground and held it in his palm. He placed it in front of Cliff and sighed helplessly. Mr. Cliff, your medical skills are so good. Do you have a way to reattach your severed finger? Cliff smiled bitterly and shook his head. The man in black threw away the severed finger with a look of regret and persuaded again, Yes, Mr. Cliff, severed fingers can't be reattached. If you are still unwilling to cooperate, then, Cliff still shook his head miserably and said, Sir, I really can't say. Otherwise, I will definitely die. Not only me, but my whole family will also die. The man in black said impatiently, I said, as long as you are willing to cooperate, we can guarantee the safety of your family. However, Cliff obviously didn't believe the man in black. After all, the people of the eastern region had tried to cause trouble in Silver Moon City twice but failed. This made many half-elves lose confidence in them. Seeing this, the man in black became angry and immediately reached out to grab Cliff's finger. Cliff screamed in fright, desperately trying to cover his hand. But how could an old doctor like him be a match for the people of the eastern region? This kind of futile struggle only added a little bit of trouble to the black-clothed men. Soon, the cold blade touched Cliff's right middle finger again. Cliff was shocked and blurted out, wait a minute. I'll cooperate, I'm willing to cooperate. The man in black smiled and stopped the movement of his hand. He patted Cliff's shoulder and said with a smile, That's right. All right, answer my question. After Marquis Vincent was assassinated, were you the one who went to check on him? Cliff opened his mouth but didn't say anything. He was actually hesitating again. The man in black sneered and stepped forward without any explanation. He grabbed Cliff's middle finger and broke it with a crack. With his fingers broken, Cliff was in so much pain that he broke free from the two men in black beside him. He fell to the ground and rolled around. The intense pain made his whole body twitch as if he would faint at any time. The leader of the men in black sighed sympathetically and said, Cliff, you're a half-elf. Why do you have to risk your life for the northern frontier? To tell you the truth, we have a lot of ways to torture people. This is just the appetizer. How could Cliff have the strength to speak? He could only desperately cover his fingers. But no matter how he covered, the blood was still flowing out. He didn't doubt that if this continued, he would faint or even die from the lack of blood. Facing the man in black's threat, Cliff could only groan continuously, I beg you, kill me, kill me. The man in black sneered and said eerily, Mr. Cliff, we have to do things according to the rules. Even if you don't want to cooperate, we have to cut off all of your fingers one by one. Then we have to cut off your arms, thighs, eyes, ears, nose, tongue. We have to take turns. So, you have to be more considerate and don't die so quickly. After saying that, he stretched out his hand to break Cliff's third finger. Cliff finally couldn't take it anymore and broke down completely. He cried and said, I'll say it all. Really? The man in black looked at Cliff with suspicion, as if he was worried that he would change his mind again. Cliff nodded continuously and said intermittently, Really, this time it's real. But I want to see your leader. I want to tell him personally. The man in black suddenly frowned and looked like he was in a difficult position. But at this moment, a young voice suddenly sounded in the dark warehouse, I'm here, Mr. Cliff. You can tell me anything. Following this voice, the man in black quickly bowed and retreated. Cliff raised his head with difficulty and saw a young man with a fair face appear in front of him. In the dim environment, he couldn't see his face clearly, but Cliff could tell from his expression and posture that he was obviously a noble. May I know who you are? I'm Viscount Fine. I'm under the orders of the Duke of St. Prospero to be in charge of the negotiation of the redemption of Marquis Vincent. Cliff hesitated, but still asked, Sir Viscounts, if I tell you everything, can you guarantee my safety? Of course we will guarantee your safety. Viscount Fine nodded seriously and said, You will leave Silver Moon City with me. As long as I'm here, you will be fine. Then what about my family? Viscount Fine hesitated, but still told the truth. I'm sorry, I can only guarantee your safety. Cliff lowered his head in disappointment. Seeing this, Viscount Fine opened his mouth again and said coldly, although we can't guarantee their safety, if we want to send them to hell, it's a piece of cake. Hearing this, Cliff's whole body began to tremble. After a while, he seemed to have finally figured it out. He raised his head and said seriously, yes, after Marquis Vincent was assassinated, I was pulled to the scene to check the situation. Viscount Fine's eyes lit up and immediately asked, what was the situation at that time? Who was the assassin? Is Marquis Vincent dead? When I rushed to the scene, I saw Marquis Vincent and Duke Modwin both lying in a pool of blood. Among them, Marquis Vincent was stabbed in the lower abdomen and the back of his heart. Although there was still a weak breath at that time, his heart was already broken and he couldn't be saved. As for Duke Modwin, his throat was cut. Judging from the shape of the wound, he must have cut it himself. When I arrived, he was already dead. Viscount Fine raised his eyebrows when he heard this. He immediately squatted in front of Cliff and stared into his eyes. He asked again, are you sure that Marquis Vincent can't be saved? Cliff nodded heavily and said, based on my 50 years of medical experience, Marquis Vincent's situation at that time, unless a miracle descends, he definitely can't be saved. Hearing such bad news, Viscount Fine revealed an excited expression. But soon he realized that something was wrong. He immediately put on a sad and angry expression and said, cunning and hateful people from the northern frontier. You've been lying to us. Cliff looked at Viscount Fine carefully and asked weakly, Lord Viscount, when are we leaving Silver Moon City? Viscount Fine stood up and hid his face in the shadows again. He said indifferently, I'll leave tonight. I'll leave tonight. As for you, you should hide for now. Cliff's expression changed drastically and he wailed, Lord, that's not what you promised me. Viscount Fine kicked away Cliff, who was trying to grab his trouser leg, and said coldly, don't worry, I'll put you in a safe place. After saying this, he ignored Cliff, who was wailing bitterly behind him and quickly walked out of the warehouse. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.